It was a typical day for a 20-year-old hard-working young mother who cherished her family and her job. She wasn't even scheduled to work at Pizza Hut that morning, but a last-minute shift change brought her face to face with pure evil. The devastating tragedy that unfolded, and the investigation that followed, revealed how deeply corruption can seep, spreading like poison. Nancy Lena Lovelady DePriest is at the center of this case, but to do that, I have to take you way back to when her parents met for the first time. The year was 1967 when Eldwin Lovelady and Jeanette Popp met at the Clover Drive-In Theater in Fort Worth, Texas. Eldwin, who went by Eddie, was from Louisiana. He was a mechanic in the Air Force and had served in Vietnam. Jeanette grew up in Fort Worth with her 4 sisters. She was in a tough financial situation and was only 14, so her mother pushed her to get married to her next-door neighbor. Jeanette dropped out of high school and had her first child, Rita, at 15 years old, which was pretty tough. I know for young moms, it's really hard to balance the responsibility of motherhood and experiencing being a young person yourself. Jeanette's mom ended up raising Jeanette's daughter, Rita, while Jeanette dropped out of high school, got divorced from her neighbor husband, and started working. When she finally turned 18, she went to a drive-in movie, and that's when she spotted the most handsome man she had ever seen, Eddie. Eddie and Jeanette fell madly in love, and before they knew it, they were married. Jeanette was pregnant, and they were headed for Spokane, Washington, for Eddie's job. Eddie was a bit of a nomad. Even though he and Jeanette lived off base as a sergeant, he was always working and traveling to new places. Jeanette was a bookworm, but she spoke her mind and made friends very quickly. On March 4th, 1968, the couple gave birth to their first child, and that is the subject of this case today, the beautiful little Nancy. Just 14 months after she was born, her parents had her little brother, Eddie Jr., who was, of course, named after his father. Jeanette found it a struggle to raise kids at such a young age, but she did her very best. Unfortunately, when she heard a rumor that her husband, who was spending most of his time stationed in Japan at the time, had a girlfriend overseas and had been cheating on her, Jeanette got understandably upset. But instead of running away with the kids, Jeanette decided to leave everything behind, including her husband and their 2 children. It may not make sense to us, but we were not in Jeanette's shoes, and there's a turning point coming up, so be patient. Jeanette, like I said, was understandably very confused, angry, and of course felt betrayed. Eddie filed for divorce in August of 1973, and then he took 4-year-old Nancy and 3-year-old Eddie away to live with him in Japan. So, Nancy's first memories as a child were made in Japan, and I have to say that must have been a very fascinating experience. It's definitely on my bucket list. Nancy was forgiving, thoughtful, and generous, and I have to wonder if much of those values were instilled in her through Japanese culture and her spending all those years there with her father. But the family did move around a lot, and Nancy was back in the United States by the time she was 10 years old. She stayed in Louisiana for a little while, then San Antonio, and also Mountain Home, Idaho, where her dad chose to settle down and get remarried. He had 3 more children, Nancy's sisters, Jerry Lee, Wendy, and Beth. Now you may be wondering, whatever happened to Nancy's mom, Jeanette? Well, by that time, she had gotten both married and divorced again and had been working at Walmart, which she really liked for the discounts. Having their mother back in their lives was definitely not easy. Jeanette and her son, Eddie Jr., had a bit of a strained relationship. After all, Jeanette didn't spend time with her kids for several years. However, Nancy, as I said, had a very forgiving nature, and no matter the distance or time, she loved her mom more than anything. She believed in second chances and developed a very close relationship and friendship with her mother. Actually, in 1983, Nancy decided to move with her mom to Graham, Texas. Graham is a decent-sized town with a population of about 8,500 people, and when I look at Graham, all I can think of is stereotypical Texas. Lots of wilderness and recreational opportunities at Graham Lake, and it has the largest town square in all of America, believe it or not. Graham still has an operating drive-in theater. And I know that I've mentioned drive-ins twice now, so I have to ask, have you ever gone to one? I used to go when I was in high school in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, with my boyfriend at the time and our friends. I'll never forget hiding our friends in the trunk so they could get in for free. If you've never been to a drive-in, I think you should try it at least once if you can still find one. Jeanette's grandparents actually lived in Graham, and that's why Jeanette moved there. Now, living together, Nancy and her mom were like sisters. They were so close, they did everything together. Nancy and Jeanette were part of the Episcopal Church, and Nancy helped her mom out with the bills, getting her first job as a waitress and her second job at Pizza Hut. Nancy's brother followed her to Graham as well. Eddie loved his sister, even though he wasn't so close with their mother. Nancy spent high school working, studying, and even participating in some beauty pageants. She was stunning, an all-American Texas girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a gorgeous white smile. And of course, since it was the 80s, Nancy put a lot of effort into her hair, and you could tell she had those curled bangs that might have been held up with a little or a lot of hairspray. Not only was Nancy beautiful on the outside, she was beautiful on the inside. I know people say that, but Nancy was a people person. She was bubbly and outgoing, had so many friends, and would be laughing and chatting with a new friend every day. She loved to talk on the phone, and many of us still do, but not as much anymore. This was the landline era, when you just had one in your bedroom for talking and having fun, which she loved. If you invited her to anything, roller skating, hiking, bowling, Nancy was 100% down for it. She loved to ski and also liked to fish. It didn't really matter what the activity was, she just loved to keep herself busy, and she left a positive impact on the people she met. It was mid-February of Nancy's senior year of high school when she met a handsome man who swept her off her feet. His name was Anthony Todd DePriest. He went by Todd. He worked at a ranch about an hour away, with dreams of joining the Air Force. He was a few years older than Nancy. She had just turned 18 at the time, and Nancy came home raving about this new man and how she wanted to get married. So of course Jeanette was kind of like, slow down, and she freaked out because Nancy reminded her so much of herself when she was 18. Jeanette knew that it hadn't worked out between her and her husband at the time, so she didn't want Nancy making the same mistake. She hoped that Nancy would graduate high school and go to college before starting a family. But when Nancy wanted something, she did what she wanted. She loved Todd. So on her birthday, March 4th, she moved in with him in Granbury, which was about an hour-and-a-half drive away. On May 1st, 1986, they were married, and soon after that, Nancy graduated from high school. It was the definition of a whirlwind romance. Jeanette was left devastated. She struggled to accept that her daughter was married, but she knew the only way to keep a relationship with Nancy was to learn to like her man, Todd, and let Nancy make her own decisions, even if it meant living through mistakes. Some of us have to. But just because a person gets married young doesn't mean it's a mistake. The thing is, Todd didn't like Jeanette either, which was understandable, given the typical mother-in-law and son-in-law situation where the mother-in-law didn't fully support her daughter's choice. But Jeanette just wanted to protect her daughter. Nancy, however, was an adult, and when she found out she was pregnant with a baby girl, she felt completely blessed. That's one thing Jeanette knew Nancy wanted, though she didn't want Nancy to experience it this fast. Jeanette always knew Nancy wanted to be a mother. She even said that she thought Nancy was born to be a mother. She was just so loving and caring. Eventually, Todd was living his dream too. He got into the Air Force, landing a job as an aircraft maintenance specialist. By December of 1986, he and Nancy decided to move to Austin, Texas, where he could work on the base, and she could get a job through Pizza Hut. She had been working there for a long time and moving up the ranks, planning to work for corporate one day. They moved into an apartment at 2000 Cedar Bend Drive in North Austin, Texas. While the big city was an adjustment, Nancy absolutely fell in love with it, but especially, she fell in love with her Pizza Hut community. There were 23 Pizza Huts in that area alone, and some people worked at multiple restaurants hopping around. They even had Pizza Hut softball tournaments. Nancy worked at 3 different locations in 2 years, and she felt like the people she met were like a second family to her. Nancy welcomed her daughter into the world in July of 1987, right in the middle of the hot, muggy, sticky Austin heat. She named her Slivia DePriest. Slivia was born with a thick head of dark hair, just like her dad. They looked like twins in a picture with Nancy, and Nancy was so in love. She talked about Todd and Slivia constantly. They were always on her mind. She had a dream that once Slivia was a toddler and old enough to walk, she was going to buy her one of those little motorized Corvettes, like the Power Wheels ones. In April of 1988, Nancy started working for the Pizza Hut near I-35 at 1011 Rainy Street. Nancy was working as an assistant manager. She showed all of her co-workers pictures of her family, and everyone knew she loved her life. I can't say this for everyone in management positions, but Nancy was a great manager, and she was happy with her job. She was caring and understanding as a supervisor, and she went out of her way to help others. By October of 1988, Nancy was 20 years old. Her baby daughter was just over a year old, 15 months to be exact, and Nancy had a routine. She would spend the mornings taking care of her daughter and the evenings managing the Raleigh Street Pizza Hut. When she wasn't working on the weekends, she would spend her time with Todd. I mentioned that Pizza Hut had a softball league. Well, Nancy was one of their most dedicated players. It wasn't that she actually loved softball. She wasn't really a softball person, but she loved events and absolutely loved connecting with people. As I said, she was truly a people person and just genuinely nice to everyone. That's why being on the team was something she dedicated much of her time to. That's actually the reason she had to switch her shift on Monday, October 24th. She was supposed to be working Monday night on the 24th, but that conflicted with a softball game. So she asked one of the managers to switch the AM and PM shifts, and she asked her babysitter to take Slivia that morning. Nancy woke up on the 24th, put her work clothes on, and made the 13-minute drive to Pizza Hut with baby Slivia in her car. Whenever both Nancy and Todd had to be somewhere, Todd would do what he did that morning. He'd follow behind Nancy on his motorcycle. Of course, they needed the car seat for Slivia, and they only had one car. Todd would switch to the car after Nancy was dropped off at work. Then, he would take the baby to the sitter, bring Nancy's car back to her workplace, and leave on his motorcycle. It sounds complicated, but this was just one of their routines. When they arrived at Pizza Hut, it was 7 a.m. Todd left his motorcycle in the parking lot, took Nancy's keys, drove Slivia to the babysitter, then came back to the Pizza Hut to get his motorcycle. He arrived back around 7:40 a.m. He knocked on the employee door of Pizza Hut, gave Nancy her car keys, and gave her a kiss goodbye. Then he drove away on his motorcycle in the direction of the Air Force Base, not knowing that that was the last time he would ever see his wife alive. It's always so shocking for me to think about that part, because you just never know. You may wonder why Nancy was getting to work so early when Pizza Hut doesn't open until 11 a.m. It's more of a lunchtime and dinner spot. Well, Nancy needed extra time because she needed to open the store, go through all the checks from the night before, and start making the pizza dough. It was part of the morning shift and the responsibility of the key holders like herself. Even though Nancy was all alone in the restaurant, all the doors were locked, so Nancy was completely safe. But when Nancy's general manager called her at 8:30 that morning to do their Monday morning check-in, she didn't answer. That was a little odd because Nancy was usually a very responsible and responsive employee. Perhaps she was just busy, so he waited a few minutes and phoned her again, but Nancy still didn't respond. By 9:30 that morning, when her boss still couldn't get a hold of her, he began to get worried. The store had to be opened on time, and of course he was also concerned about why Nancy wouldn't be answering after calling her again and again for the past hour. That wasn't normal. He decided to head over to the restaurant, wondering if maybe Nancy forgot that she had switched to the morning shift, or if she was just running behind or busy. When he arrived, he noticed something unusual right away. The employee door was not locked. Usually, this door is locked until normal business hours. What this meant to him was that Nancy had made it to the restaurant and unlocked the door, but he wondered why she seemingly hadn't locked it behind her once she made it inside. Upon first glance around the dining area when he stepped in, he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary until he took his first few steps further inside. That's when he became concerned and confused. The restaurant floor was covered in water. It was about an inch deep all over. It looked like the place had been completely flooded. So what happened? He called out to Nancy. He didn't get a response. As he stepped deeper into the restaurant, he could see and hear that the dough machine was still running in the prep kitchen, which meant that Nancy was there. But where was all the water coming from? And where was she? The manager knew something wasn't right. He walked towards the counter, which faced the front of the store, past the counter, and went around the corner. That's when he realized the water seemed to be coming from the men's restroom. When he opened the door, he realized why Nancy wasn't answering. He saw her bare, unclothed body lying beneath the sink. This was a horrible sight for him to see. She was clearly unresponsive, bleeding from her head, her blonde hair stained red. He knew it was Nancy right away. Her eyes were still open, but it was like she couldn't see him. She was just staring blankly. The manager rushed back outside to alert the authorities. Rookie cop officer Scott Ahart from the Austin PD was dispatched, along with his partner. When they arrived and got inside, they also saw all the water on the floor. They noticed there was more of it, in higher concentration, near the restrooms, which made sense. They made their way into the men's restroom, where the water seemed to be pouring out. When they opened the door, they saw the woman lying inside. As Officer Ahart quickly looked around, taking everything in, he saw what he described as spots of coagulated blood in the water next to her. He could tell that she was tied up with her bra, and it appeared as though she had suffered a gunshot wound to the head. By the initial appearance of everything, Officer Ahart thought she was deceased. But then, all of a sudden, he saw what he thought was her breathing. As he got closer, he realized she was still alive. He started talking to her, trying to get her to respond, but she didn't. All she could do was gasp for air. Of course, they radioed for emergency services, and they rushed Nancy to Brackenridge Hospital. She was in very critical condition and not expected to survive. Medical personnel quickly began working to try to save Nancy's life. She underwent emergency surgery before they even had a chance to officially identify her. Her family was unaware that this normal day at work had turned so deadly. Imagine her mother, her husband, going about their day as usual, unaware that any of this was happening. Notification would have to wait. The hospital's first priority was to do what they could to save their patient's life. Meanwhile, investigators from the Austin Police Department had been called out to the Pizza Hut. Once there, they immediately began processing the crime scene as though it were a homicide. They started putting crime scene tape up, and the Pizza Hut was closed to the public for the foreseeable future. First, they wanted to look into the cause of the flooding, which became obvious once they examined the men's room. Stuffed into the sink, plugging the drain, was a blue apron. The faucet was still running, and the water had overflowed onto the floor, causing part of the restaurant to flood. It was highly unlikely that Nancy had been washing her clothes. This was clearly an attempt by the perpetrator to wash away all the evidence. Right near the toilet on the ground, there appeared to be a pair of khaki pants and light blue underwear crumpled on the ground. The lid to the garbage bin was on top of them. Nearby was a white button-down dress shirt, which appeared to have blood on it. It seemed that these were Nancy's clothes. Her bra had been used by the assailant to tie her hands behind her back, and it was still on her when she was taken away from the scene. The person who did this had tried to get rid of all the evidence, but there was something obvious they left behind: a single .22 caliber shell casing, which was submerged under the water right next to where Nancy had been lying. All this evidence was collected and taken back to the crime lab for analysis. Even though it was the 80s, even the late 80s, it was a lot different back then, nothing close to what we can accomplish today. Considering Nancy was nude, the investigators assumed this was a male perpetrator and they believed she was most likely sexually violated. At this point, they went through the Pizza Hut looking for signs of a struggle. When they looked at the lock on the door, it was completely intact. There was no sign of a break-in. So they began to wonder, had Nancy let her attacker inside? Did she know them? Or maybe they followed her inside, overpowering her as she entered. Or did this person have a key? There was one sign of a struggle. They found a single strand of hair in an area of the restaurant where customers waited for their pizzas and played arcade games. The hair was missing its root, which would make it really hard to identify through DNA analysis, but it was still the best evidence they had. I'm wondering how they knew that a single hair in a restaurant frequented by so many people would be related to this crime. Next, the investigators checked the cash register, wondering if this was a robbery. That year, there had been a string of robberies in Austin, and criminals were actually targeting Pizza Huts. I'm not sure how much money Pizza Huts usually keep in store, but it was the 80s, and lots of people were paying in cash. In the 4 robberies, no one had been hurt, and all those robberies had occurred in the late afternoon or early evening, so it seemed unlikely that this was connected. But when they checked the floor safe in the back of the restaurant, it was open. It's where employees would deposit their nightly cash, usually in a bank bag, but not in this case. It seemed to be missing. They checked the receipts, and there was exactly $150 in cash unaccounted for. Of course, this was enough to raise a red flag, but they wondered, would this warrant taking Nancy's life? Maybe she could have identified the robber, and they decided this was the only way to silence her. Or maybe Nancy was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sadly, Nancy wasn't doing well at all. They had done all they could to try to save her life. She was the only witness, and they were hoping she would somehow make it, not only so she could tell them who did this, but because investigators had learned she was a mother and a wife, and they were so saddened by what they had witnessed. She was so young and had so much life to live. Unfortunately, Nancy was in a coma, clinging to life. She was put on life support while her loved ones were contacted so they could say their last goodbyes. Todd was at the Air Force Base when he got the call that Nancy was in the hospital. It was a moment of sheer panic. He had just seen her that morning. How was she now on life support? He dropped everything and drove his motorcycle to the hospital. When he was given the information about Nancy's condition, he called Jeanette. Jeanette and Eddie Jr. had just moved to a tiny home in Cedar Creek Lake, and it didn't even have a landline yet. Jeanette had spent the whole day going to convenience stores looking for jobs, so she didn't get home until 4 p.m. That's when her landlord knocked on her door and told her she had an emergency call. Jeanette picked up the phone asking, "What's the matter?" Todd said, "It's Nancy." There was so much fear in his voice that Jeanette knew something was wrong. Jeanette asked, "Is she okay?" She was freaking out at this point. Todd said, "There's been a robbery and she's been shot." Jeanette asked how badly she was hurt, and that's when Todd broke down crying. Between sobs, he told Jeanette that Nancy was on life support and probably wouldn't make it, and that the hospital staff had given him the go-ahead to pull the plug whenever he felt ready. Jeanette, of course, was distraught. She was hysterical and just screamed, but in her heart she knew that Nancy would not want to live in that state, unable to truly live. She agreed with Todd to take her off life support, but begged him to wait until she could be by Nancy's side. He told her he would. Jeanette was 3.5 hours away and not immediately able to get a ride. While Todd stayed by his wife's side, Jeanette couldn't get there until early the next morning. At 10:45 that night, the doctors pronounced that Nancy had irreversible damage. They could keep her on life support, but unfortunately, her wounds were so severe that the moment she was taken off, she would die. Right after Jeanette arrived, she kissed Nancy and told her goodbye. It was hard to turn off that machine, knowing that was the end. Nancy was an organ donor, so through her tragic murder, she was able to help several people who needed transplants. She was able to donate her heart, liver, both of her kidneys, and her bone marrow. This procedure honors and respects the donor while harvesting their organs. It takes between 24 to 36 hours to complete. Afterward, professionals are still able to move forward with things like an autopsy and funeral arrangements, which would come very soon. Right after Nancy was pronounced dead, her case was officially labeled a homicide investigation. A homicide detective, Hector Polanco, was assigned as the lead on the case. He was notorious for being quick and dirty with his investigations. He did whatever he could to always close his cases and get a confession. They were counting on him. Detective Polanco talked to the general manager, who had been the one to find Nancy that morning. He had a good alibi and was ruled out as a suspect, but he was able to provide important information about the standard routine for Pizza Hut managers and shift leaders like Nancy, who had a master key to access all the stores, not just that location. This meant that key holders could walk into any Pizza Hut in Austin, Texas. There was now a very large pool of people Polanco needed to interview who could have targeted Nancy. First, they wanted to rule out everyone who worked at the Riley location and then move on to other stores. At the same time, their prime suspect was actually Nancy's husband, Todd, the one who had just pulled the plug. However, his alibi checked out quickly. Investigators were going with the theory that Nancy knew her attacker. She was so reliable that she wouldn't have let just anyone inside the restaurant unless they were familiar to her or were a fellow employee. It was also relayed to Polanco that Nancy had called a produce company around 8:30. A man spoke to someone there to make an order for some items for the restaurant. That was the last time anyone had heard from her, so they had a time frame between 8:30 a.m. and just before 10 a.m. when her manager found her. By the next morning, Nancy's case was already all over the Texas news. Officer Polanco did his best not to reveal any details of the case to the public, hoping to catch the perpetrator by what they knew about the crime. Nancy had been such a bright, nurturing young mother, and though very few people knew how badly she'd been hurt, they wanted the person who did this to be behind bars. There was already so much pressure being put on authorities. That year, there had been 45 homicides, and there were no crime scene investigators back then. Homicide detectives did everything. There were only 6 of them, and they were burning out. It was not an easy task. They had to go to all the crime scenes at any hour, day or night. They'd be called in and would have to immediately stop what they were doing and rush over, sometimes working on more than one case at a time. They processed the crime scene, submitted all the evidence, and hand-wrote their notes and reports. It was a lot, and many of them were working 48-hour shifts with no sleep. You have one job as a homicide detective, to solve the murder. Their goal is to close every single case, and if they don't, they're seen as a failure. Their job depends on figuring it out, and there's a lot of pressure from outside the force as well. The victim's family is calling in every day, asking for updates on the progress of the case, and it hardly seems like it's ever moving fast enough, especially back then, not to mention how scared the community becomes. This means that detectives like Polanco are in a hurry to figure things out. He wasted no time and began interviewing every employee at the Riley location. Just days later, by October 27th, he had interviewed every single person on the staff. Each one seemed to have adored Nancy, and Polanco was understandably frustrated because he had no viable suspects yet. He told all the employees to report any suspicious behavior that they witnessed going forward to the Austin PD. Soon after this, Nancy's autopsy results came back from the Travis County Medical Examiner's office. She had an entrance wound 3.5 inches above her left ear. Her hair was shaved in this location to get a closer look at the surface of the wound. There was no stippling present, which meant that the gun was not close up when it was shot, but more of what was described in the report as a distant type wound. The projectile went through her skull, through the brain, from the back to the front, toward the front orbital area, and was lodged inside. They were able to retrieve a mushroom .22 caliber lead bullet, which was preserved and sent over to Sergeant Hector Polanco on October 26, '88 at 9:40 a.m. The next part of this report confirmed investigators' fears about Nancy being violated by a male perpetrator. For the manner of death, the report reads, "It is my opinion, based on the investigation of the circumstances and findings at autopsy, that the decedent, Nancy Lena Day Priest, came to her death as a result of a gunshot wound of the head, distant type, associated with sexual assault. It was ruled a homicide." The semen sample was sent to the lab for DNA processing, which, by the way, was limited. They used to call it DNA fingerprinting back then. It had nothing to do with fingerprints. It was just mapping of the DNA, and it had just been introduced that year in forensic cases. First, it's always great to be able to say deoxyribonucleic acid, which is abbreviated as DNA. DNA testing started with paternity testing in the 80s, and then they realized we get 50% of our DNA from our father and the other half from our mother. This advanced into being used as a forensic tool. However, 99.9% of human DNA sequences are the same in every single human being, but there are parts of our DNA that are of course unique to each of us, except for identical twins. The analysis would isolate that part of the DNA. Back in 1988, though, the science relied heavily on blood typing, and as you're probably aware, many of us have the same blood type. There are only 4 main blood types: A, B, AB, and O. You can have a combination of those, so there are 8 different blood types. Blood type doesn't lend much to telling what we look like, so it's not exactly a reliable tool when figuring out who your suspects are. Back then, if somebody was killed and had, let's say, a blood type of O, and they found other blood on the scene, let's say from the attacker who had a different type of blood, then maybe they'd be looking for someone with that blood type since it's different from the victim's. That's how they could rule out a suspect. If somebody had a different blood type than what they found on the scene, and it wasn't the victim's, that would be seen as more likely to be found at crime scenes than blood. So they began using that to extract DNA, but back then they used restriction fragment length polymorphism. You've probably seen this before, maybe you don't remember the name of it, but it looks like this. It's when lines are compared in 2 samples, and if they are the same, then they conclude the same person was there. If not, it's not a match. The point is, it wasn't the most accurate science back then. Plus, you needed a sample of a suspect's DNA to test and compare to what you found, so the detectives had to do the real boots-on-the-ground investigation before this could even come into play. That meant isolating someone as their prime suspect. It wasn't long before the Riley location pizza was back in business, but now they had hired a new security guard named Lorenzo. Everyone was scared there would be another robbery and someone else could be hurt, so Lorenzo actually stood guard at the front door and monitored the restaurant and the patrons inside and outside. Remember when the investigators told the employees to call them if they saw anything suspicious? Well, let's fast forward to November 9th. A little after 2 weeks from when Nancy was killed, Austin PD got a call from the night manager at the Rainy Pizza location. She said that 2 young men had come into the restaurant. They pulled into the parking lot and just sat there with their headlights shining toward the restaurant for about 5 minutes. Then they went inside, sat down, and ordered 2 beers. They were just sitting there, sipping their beers while scanning the restaurant in silence for a while. Then they clinked their beer mugs together. What was weird was what they were overheard saying by the security guard. They were toasting in Nancy's memory. But as far as the night manager knew, these guys didn't know Nancy personally, so why were they even there? They were happily at the scene where her murder took place, making a toast, which raised a red flag. But there was more. Lorenzo was on duty that night, and one of the young men approached him, asking why he was acting like a security guard. The guy introduced himself as Richard and started asking about Nancy, whether it was true that she was found near the cash register, and if the police had identified any suspects. He also wanted to know if Nancy had been shot. When Lorenzo said that was classified information, Richard speculated that 2 people might be responsible. Lorenzo was getting creeped out now, so he asked Richard who he was and where he was at the time of the murder. Richard replied that he worked at the North Lamar Pizza Hut and was opening that store at the same time that Nancy was killed. Then the two men left before they had even finished their beers. Well, that was another red flag. Richard worked at another Pizza Hut location and opened, which meant he had a master key. The night manager from the Rainey location reported all of this suspicious behavior to the police, who made note of everything. Sergeant Borman of the Austin PD followed up with Lorenzo to see what he knew about the two men in the restaurant and Nancy's death. Lorenzo had not heard what type of bullet was found in Nancy's body, and he also didn't know what items of clothing had caused the bathroom to flood, or any specifics about the crime scene. Then Sergeant Borman started looking into Richard from the North Lamar Pizza Hut, and this is what he found. Richard Danziger was 18 years old. He worked at both the Red Lobster and the North Lamar Pizza Hut location. He had just started dating his manager Donna, and in September his roommate Christopher Okoa was a line cook at the Pizza Hut on Guadalupe Street. Christopher was 22 years old, and definitely the guy who had gone with Richard to make that toast in Nancy's memory. This meant that all three of them were employees who knew the layout of Pizza Hut, and two of them had master keys. Borman had a feeling that Richard and Christopher were somehow involved and wondered if Nancy might have known them, since remember, she bounced between different restaurants in the Austin area and played on the Pizza Hut softball team. Had Richard or Christopher maybe targeted Nancy? Had they tried to rob the store and didn't know that Nancy was going to be there that morning? Or were they just innocently having a drink at a location? Sergeant Borman figured out the address to Richard and Christopher's apartment, which they shared with Richard's brother, Ralph, and a roommate named Roger Lewis. Richard and Christopher weren't home at the time, so Sergeant Borman found Donna's address. On Friday, November 11th, he paid her a visit. When he arrived, her boyfriend Richard was sitting on the couch. Borman asked Richard if he would mind coming outside and talking to him for a moment. Richard agreed. Outside, Borman explained that he was investigating Nancy DePriest's murder and hoped that Richard would come into the police station and give a statement. That's when the story gets strange. This is from the records of the investigators involved. At this point, there were Sergeant Borman, Detective Polanco, and Detective Sergeant Edward Balaja. The report noted that Richard pointed through the door in Donna's direction, saying, "That's my alibi," pointing to his girlfriend. He explained he was asleep at the time that Nancy was murdered. But didn't he initially say to Lorenzo that he had been opening up the North Lamar location that morning? Sergeant Borman asked Richard to come back with him to the station, where he took turns interviewing Richard with Detective Polanco. Richard said he heard that Nancy was shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber gun, and that the perpetrator had stuffed a blue apron in the women's restroom to flood the store and erase evidence. The investigators were pretty shocked. They didn't know how he could have known that. Lorenzo, the security guard closer to the case, hadn't even known those details. Richard claimed he heard it from Donna's supervisor, the general manager of the North Lamar store. But Borman already had that supervisor's number on speed dial. He left the room, called them up, and asked them what color the apron was that was found in the restroom. The supervisor said they didn't know. So how did Richard know these details? This was not looking good for him. Borman told Richard that nobody could have possibly known that information unless they had been at the crime scene. Richard denied that he was ever there. He wasn't fessing up. Later that night, Sergeant Balaja questioned him, and Balaja asked Richard what he could tell him about the murder at Pizza Hut. The same questions again. Richard claimed he didn't know anything. He said he had an alibi. He said that on the night of October 23rd, he and his friend Christopher bought some beer, went to Donna's house at 10 p.m., and that Donna was ironing in the kitchen. So Christopher and Richard just hung out and played cards. They invited some of Donna's friends to play a drinking game with them around 11 p.m. Then Christopher was getting tired, so he left. But within minutes, he said Christopher came back to the apartment, saying that his car key was broken. So they called Roger, their other roommate, to come get him at 2 a.m., the early morning hours when Nancy was shot. Roger and Christopher left together, and Richard spent the night at his girlfriend Donna's house. Richard said that he and Donna were pretty drunk at that point, and that he knew he had to get to work by 8 o'clock in the morning. But he passed out, and before he knew it, it was 9:30 and he was late. He said that Donna got a phone call from the North Lamar Pizza Hut. It was the morning manager contacting them to try to find Richard. As soon as Donna hung up, Richard got ready and rushed out to Pizza Hut after 10 a.m. Interesting, was he really sleeping, or was he over at the Riley location violating and killing Nancy? So this was Richard's alibi, his girlfriend. He hadn't even answered Donna's phone, so the morning shift manager wouldn't be able to confirm that he was really there. Donna could be covering for him. Richard allegedly told Sergeant Balaja, "You don't have any evidence that would link me to this crime." When Balaja suggested that Richard's explanation of the night made him sound guilty of capital murder, Richard said, "You're not going to pin a capital murder on me." But why did he know about the .22 caliber bullet and the blue work apron? However, it's true there was no direct evidence against him, so he was released, and the police did not write an official statement from him at this point. On the same day, November 11th, while Richard was being interrogated, Christopher was working at the Guadalupe Pizza Hut. When Sergeant Borman and a woman detective pulled him aside, they explained they wanted to question him about the murder of Nancy DePriest. Christopher, just like Richard, was like, "Sure." He offered to drive himself to the station, but the detectives said they wanted him to come in a police car. Christopher had no idea that the police had been called when he and Richard made that toast to Nancy and that they were suspects. Once at the station, Sergeant Borman asked Christopher a few questions about the murder while they were sitting in a cubicle. Then they moved him into an interview room. Borman then left, and another detective came in and introduced himself as Sergeant Polanco. He told Christopher that on the streets, they called him El Diablo. For context, Sergeant Polanco and Christopher both spoke Spanish as their first language. El Diablo means the devil, which in the context of an interview room at a police station could be a bit threatening. Recall that I told you Polanco had this reputation for closing his cases fast and dirty, and one reason is because he didn't play nicely. If you can think of good cop, bad cop, he'd be the bad cop. It didn't take long for him to use this scare tactic to intimidate Christopher. Polanco pounded his fist on the table and even started yelling. Christopher appeared to be shocked. Polanco told Christopher that if he knew who hurt Nancy, he needed to tell them the truth. If Christopher didn't tell the truth, he'd be charged with capital murder and given the death penalty, which in Texas is a common sentence. Christopher told him he did not know who did this. After a while, Polanco switched tactics and left the room. There are actually a lot of interesting interrogation tactics utilized by investigators. One is to leave the suspect alone and record them to see if they say anything out of the ordinary. At this time, it wasn't commonplace to have video and audio recording going on, but the tactic of making them sweat, so to speak, can work, and you can get a confession. Sergeant Balaja was the one who had been interviewing Richard, and he came in playing the good cop. They were utilizing this well-known tactic. Balaja apologized to Christopher, saying, "I'm so sorry for my hot-headed partner." He said Christopher could go home as long as he was telling them the truth. Again, Christopher pushed back, insisting he didn't know anything. Then Balaja left and Polanco came back in. Christopher was not under arrest, but he also hadn't requested an attorney, so the questioning continued. I want to remind everyone, you should always remain silent and ask for an attorney if you're being questioned. It's your right. It's your right to remain silent, so use it. Bano asked Christopher about his alibi. Christopher said that at 8 a.m., he was asleep in the apartment that he shared with Roger, Richard, and Ralph. He said he did remember that around maybe 8:30 that morning, he heard Roger talking in the room next to him on the phone with one of the pizza managers, and said that Richard was spending the night at Donna's. Polanco wasn't sure if that was the truth. He left, and Bala entered. This went on for hours. Hours. It was all they had to go on. They had to get to the bottom of it. Polanco returned and reminded Christopher once again that this was a death penalty state, and they were hoping it would break him down. Christopher said he didn't do anything, and begged Polano to please believe him. Then Balaja came back in, and Christopher said he only knew what he told them because he saw it on the news. Polano showed Christopher a picture of death row and promised he would never get a chance to hug his family again. But still, Christopher told him he didn't know anything. That's when Polano said he knew that Christopher didn't have a criminal history, that he was an honor student, and he came from a hard-working family. He had no history of violence, and that meant he must be covering for his friend Richard. He needed to come clean. If not, they would both go down for this crime and be put to death by lethal injection. When Polano used the scare tactic to elicit shock, he showed Christopher an autopsy picture of Nancy. He asked, "Don't you feel bad for her?" and urged Christopher to confess who did this. Polano thought that Christopher had maybe seen everything happen and blocked it out of his memory. He was just trying to get Christopher to remember how he was involved, or maybe he was just trying to protect Richard. Maybe he didn't want to rat out his longtime friend. So Polano said that Richard was in the next room and was ready to put all the blame on Christopher. Another tactic: pit one suspect against the other, hoping that one of them will break. The detective went on to explain that Richard was probably going to walk free because he was a white guy, and white guys always got the better end of the stick. He told Christopher, "It's time for a minority to have the chance to win." Christopher still claimed he didn't know anything. Polano left and came back, saying when Christopher goes to jail, he would be fresh meat for all the other inmates. Well, they were well into the interview at this point. Christopher thought he was going to be sent to jail. They interviewed him for 20 hours over the course of 2 days. He was exhausted, he hadn't seen the sun in hours, and he just wanted to go home. That's when he started to crack. He was ready to make a statement. His story changed, which is never a good sign. Detective Blanco pulled out a typewriter and asked if Christopher was involved in the crime. Christopher said yes, but admitted Richard was the mastermind. Christopher ended up confessing that he was the accomplice, but it gets crazier. If this was simple, I would not be sharing this case. It's wild. After typing out Christopher's horrific recollection of what he and Richard did to poor Nancy, Christopher was finally ready to go home. He really thought he was going to just go home after this. Of course, Balaja said he couldn't let him leave because he had to give them hair, blood, and semen samples. Christopher agreed, and they went to the hospital and took all the samples they needed. Do they take semen samples? I always thought they took regular DNA and just used the scene to extract the DNA. I don't know, this was the 80s. They did a lot of things back then. Christopher agreed, and they went to the hospital. They took the samples, but they still needed a warrant to arrest him, and they weren't actually done talking to him. But they weren't ready to take him to jail either. They actually got a hotel for Christopher for the weekend as they sorted through all the gruesome details of Nancy's murder. They tried to explain to Christopher that since he made this statement against his friend Richard, it really wouldn't be a good idea to go back to the apartment they shared. What if Richard came after him? At this point, Christopher was so exhausted, he just agreed to whatever. He stayed at the hotel, but did call Roger and asked, "Do you have a number for a lawyer?" Well, on Monday, November 14th, Balaja and Polano came to the hotel and took Christopher back to the police station. Polano had found out that Christopher called Roger looking for an attorney, so now Polano had more reason to suspect that these guys were guilty. If the confession wasn't enough, just so you know, getting a lawyer is not evidence of guilt. At the station, they began the next half of Christopher's interrogation. He even agreed to a recorded statement. At first, he said on tape that Richard had gone inside to rob the Pizza Hut, and Christopher waited outside the entire time. But then they made him take a polygraph test. When the investigators came back, they told him he failed. But as we know, polygraphs are not a great indication of whether or not someone is truly lying. They're just kind of a scare tactic. Polano told Christopher that he thought Christopher was inside the Pizza Hut when Nancy was killed, and that Christopher was the one who shot Nancy, even though Richard was the one who had the idea in the first place. If he confessed his guilt, they could reduce his sentence from death and give Christopher 60 years in prison instead. That's when Christopher said yes and confessed to everything in the police's statement. Christopher said he and Richard had planned to rob the Rainy Street Pizza Hut while they were playing cards at Donna's house. Christopher didn't want to do it, but Richard asked Christopher for his help, and that was his best friend. He finally agreed. Richard told Christopher that he would invite Roger over, and Christopher could go home with him, and then Richard could stay at Donna's. Therefore, both of them would have alibis. At 7 a.m., the two of them met up at McDonald's, which they did. Richard showed up with a gun in his pants, driving his girlfriend's car. They parked their cars at a nearby apartment complex across the street and watched Nancy get dropped off outside the Pizza Hut around 7:30 and go inside. That's when they used Donna's key to open the side door. Inside, Nancy was preparing dough. She saw Christopher and said, "What's up, Christopher?" That's when Richard told Nancy to shut up and show him the money. He threatened her at gunpoint, and Nancy gave him the money from the safe. That's when Richard promised to have fun and proceeded to violate her in multiple places around the restaurant. Richard then instructed Christopher to tie her up and to also have some fun with her. Polano wrote that Christopher said they did this to her 8 times while Nancy begged for them to stop. Then Richard said that they would have to kill Nancy because she could recognize them. Richard then shot Nancy in the head, and both of them proceeded to violate her again before putting her clothes in the sink to wash away all the evidence. Christopher signed the statement in front of witnesses. I am truly shocked by how brutal that story was. But wait, because you haven't even heard the details. Those details come out at trial, and it is just unreal. But there were some inconsistencies, like the timing. Remember that Todd said he came back with his motorcycle, and that the last time he saw Nancy was not when she was originally dropped off? There's a little bit of a discrepancy there because they said that they went in and started doing this to her after she got dropped off. But the thing is, we know she saw her husband, so that wasn't exactly a good time frame. They also wanted to know why Richard and Christopher decided not to relock the Pizza Hut door if they had the key. Did they just forget, or were they in a rush? And was there any evidence that Nancy knew Christopher and Richard? Did they engage in intercourse, and how many times? If they only found one hair at the scene, there was also that call to the produce company at 8:30. But it's true. Sometimes criminals don't exactly have time to look at their watches. They have more important things at hand. Right after Sergeant Balaja had sat through this confession, he called and told his brother that he had just interviewed the devil himself, that Christopher had dead eyes, and he had never been in the presence of someone so cold before in his life. I know I haven't gone into the details about this confession. We will get there. But the gist of it was that it all started as a robbery and escalated when they realized that Nancy could identify them, so they had to kill her. Christopher was arrested on November 14th. But now it was up to a jury to decide whether the evidence existed that matched up with this confession. I told you much more would come at trial on November 15th. Christopher's partner in crime, Richard, was visiting his family when he was also arrested. He provided blood, hair, semen, and saliva samples, and he and Christopher were both charged with capital murder. But here's the thing. In Texas, a confession is not enough evidence to convict someone of murder. There has to be evidence tying the confession to the truth. There just wasn't yet. They had to prove that the hair and the bullet shell found at the scene belonged to either Richard or Christopher. But these tests take time. As for Nancy's family, Jeanette found out Christopher and Richard were in jail, and she felt a sense of relief. Alanko told her he had no doubt he had found the men who had done this to her daughter, and that the confession was shocking. That was really hard for her to hear. It was bad enough to imagine what Nancy went through, but to know the truth was horrific. It was a lot to take in. Actually, since Nancy's murder, Jeanette had been depressed. She exhibited signs of self-harm. She was smoking 4 packs of cigarettes every day, and she lost 30 pounds. Her sister had to slap her across the face and say that she needed to take care of herself and her grief, transforming her self-hatred over Nancy's death into hatred for the two people who did this. Knowing that they were behind bars didn't mean she was able to move on, but justice was going to be served. Nancy's death left a huge hole in the lives of Todd, her daughter Slivia, Jeanette, Eddie, and Eddie Jr. No one could believe something like this could happen to someone like Nancy. On November 21st, Christopher and Richard had their bond hearings. At the hearing, the defense argued they could not be held in jail without bond, unless the prosecution provided evidence that a jury would be able to convict them. The prosecution said there was no evidence, so they were held without bond. Each of them could have paid the bond, but it was $100,000 each, so they were going to stay in jail. Now they had to wait for the Texas Department of Public Safety to process the DNA of the semen and the hair found at the crime scene. When the results came back, Todd was ruled out as a suspect. They had to do this even though he had an alibi because spouses are usually involved somehow. But this time, Todd's semen and hair did not match up. Richard's semen sample also came back negative, which means that even though Christopher confirmed that Richard had violated Nancy multiple times, Richard likely didn't, or maybe he didn't finish, so to speak. But it was Christopher's DNA that came back unconfirmed. He was the one that could not be eliminated. In 1988, as I tried to explain, it was possible that if someone had the same blood type as Nancy, her blood group markers would hide the perpetrator's DNA. It's a very tricky analytical process because the Texas Department could not differentiate the samples. They sent it to the Forensic Science Associates. The DNA analyst, Edward Blake, said that because of Christopher's DQ alpha markers, which he shared with 16% of the Mexican-American population, his semen sample could not be ruled out. Now let me tell you about that hair. Back then, they did visual comparisons. We're talking not too scientific here, although they did look at them under a microscope. The hair was found at the scene and compared to Nancy's, but by comparison, it was ruled out. It did not belong to her. Christopher's head and pubic hair did not match up either, but when it was compared to Richard's pubic hair, it was consistent. The hair's color and texture were similar enough that it pointed to him as a suspect. But remember, they didn't have the root. They weren't able to test it for actual DNA. And I'm not trying to go all TMI here, but comparing pubic hair, I'm pretty sure you know what I'm thinking. How many different styles are there? Please don't Google it. Apparently there are 4 basic ones. Look at the screen if you're interested in learning something new today, because I did. They're called terminal hairs, and they're obviously a different texture than our scalp hair, as we know. But anyway, in preparation for the trial, Christopher's defense attorney, Nate STK, sat down with him to go over his case. Christopher wanted to somehow make a deal to get a lighter sentence, and insisted he was actually innocent. Shockingly, his own attorney wasn't buying it. The attorney explained that based on the brutality of his confession and his DNA results being inconclusive, it was clear he was guilty. The only way he was going to avoid death was by pleading guilty and then testifying against his roommate, Richard. That was his best chance. At that point, the DNA testers even reached out to Christopher's attorney to ask if they wanted another DNA test, and the attorney said no. He stated there was no chance Christopher was innocent. Also, while Christopher and his defense attorney talked, something changed. It seemed as though more information was coming to light. Official documents with the confession in its entirety were typed and completed by Detective Balaja. The date was March 19, 1989, and 1 month later, a year after Nancy was killed, authorities told the media that Richard was not the one who shot the gun that killed Nancy. It was Christopher. He had confessed. So now, the prosecution would only be trying Richard before a grand jury on the sexual-related charges. On April 26th, a grand jury indicted Richard. On May 5th, Christopher pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in a plea deal that would have him receive life in prison without parole and not face the murder charge if he testified against Richard. Richard Danziger's trial began on January 22nd, 1990. Richard pled not guilty. The star witness was his former roommate and friend, Christopher Okoa. The DA prosecuting the case was Claire Dawson, and she told Nancy's mother not to be in court that day. She didn't want her to hear the brutality that her poor daughter faced. But Jeanette told her, "You don't understand. I have to. I can't live without knowing what they did to my baby." So she stayed and listened as Christopher took the stand. I pulled up part of this transcript, and I was shocked. It's just so horrible, and I can't even share everything because it's not only disrespectful, you could use your imagination, but I'm certainly not permitted to say it on this platform. It started with what we already know, that on October 23rd, Richard and Christopher went to Donna's. They drank and played some games. Richard wanted money, Christopher didn't want to do it. Richard had a whole plan with Roger and Donna as their allies. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Roger came over, and he and Christopher drove both their cars to their apartment instead of Roger and Christopher taking the same car. Christopher only slept an hour before he committed the crimes against Nancy. Christopher and Richard went in with the key. They demanded that Nancy open the safe and give them the money, which she did. But this is where the story changes. When Richard decided they needed to kill Nancy, they had already gagged her. Then they brought her to the hall near the bathrooms, the area where the video games are, where people normally waited on their pizzas, and they threw her on the bench. They tied her hands behind her back. Christopher said that Richard then unzipped his pants and, let's just say, he was doing something to himself that was really inappropriate while telling Nancy he was going to bone her. Then Richard forced her to kneel down, handed Christopher the gun, and told Christopher to kill her. Christopher got behind her, had the gun in his left hand, and had his right hand on her right shoulder. Christopher said that she was begging for him not to hurt her, saying, "Please don't, please don't." He said he pulled the trigger and shot her in the back of the head. Then she slumped forward, and when he let her go, her body fell face first onto the tile floor. That's when Christopher said he asked himself, "What have I done?" Then Christopher said they took her into the women's bathroom, and he pointed to where it is on a diagram so the jury could see. The prosecutor asked how they got her in there, and he said they dragged her. Christopher said he held the door open, and Richard picked her up from the shoulders and dragged her inside. They had previously gagged her, and at this point, Richard took that gag from her mouth. Christopher said he just yanked it off and proceeded to have intercourse with her down there, and also in her mouth. Yeah, the prosecutor asked Christopher if Nancy was bleeding, and he said yes. But when he was asked if she was moving, he said no. At that point, they thought she was already dead. Wow, how cruel and how disgusting. After Richard was finished, he told Christopher it was his turn to have some fun with Nancy. At first, Christopher said he didn't want to do it, but that made Richard mad. He told Christopher, "You're going to do it." So he finally said all right, and he took his penis out of his pants. Richard said, "You're going to have some fun with her too." Christopher said he proceeded to put his penis into her vagina and ejaculated inside, then pulled it out. The prosecutor asked if Nancy was saying anything to them before she was killed, and Christopher said that Nancy was saying, "Please stop, don't." But Richard told him he wanted to tie her up and gag her, so they did, using a scarf. It made her beg for her life. That's when Nancy's mom became physically ill in the courtroom. She was so sick to her stomach, listening to how much her poor daughter suffered and what these nasty, vile men did to her. She had to leave the room and ran to the restroom to throw up. Back to Christopher's testimony. He said to clean up the scene, he wiped down all the countertops they had touched and helped Richard use the bathroom water to wash Nancy's body and erase as much evidence as possible. Then they wiped down the restroom. They used a blue apron to stop up the sink drain and left the water running to cover their tracks. Christopher gave the money to Richard, and together, they left in separate vehicles. Then Christopher said on November 9th, the night they visited the Arlie Pizza Hut, Richard and Christopher were at Donna's house again. They had been drinking wine and hanging out when Richard said he'd been at that location that day. Apparently, while he was at work at a different location, his boss had asked him to bring some checks over there. At that point, Richard asked Christopher, "Hey, do you want to go over there and see it?" Christopher said he just wanted to go home, but Richard convinced him. Christopher admitted he could be a bit gullible at times, so they drove over to the Pizza Hut anyway. That's when they sat down, ordered a beer, and Richard told Christopher that he recognized the security guard and the manager. Christopher didn't want to be there. You already know what happened. They walked over to the security guard and started making some weird comments and questions about the murder. After this, they went home. You know the rest. Polano and Bala both testified for the prosecution, saying that Christopher was shaken up during his interview, but Richard was calm and couldn't be intimidated. Donna also testified against her boyfriend Richard. She said the night before the murder, Christopher and Richard were talking while she was ironing in the kitchen, so she couldn't hear them. They could have talked about anything. At 11 p.m., her friend arrived, and they played a drinking game. Richard and Christopher left for a few minutes and said Christopher's car key was broken. At 2 a.m., they called Roger to come pick Christopher up. Roger showed up, stayed for a drink, and then Donna was drunk enough that she lost track of time. Roger and Christopher left at some point together. The next day, she said she woke up to the phone ringing, and Richard was the one who answered the phone, not Donna. It was Donna's supervisor asking why the store wasn't open. Donna and Richard started getting ready for work around 9:15. Donna actually had children, and as Richard's supervisor, it was her role to pick up the slack. So it was a mad dash for her to get her 2 kids ready to leave. When Donna got in her car, she realized that the front seat was pushed back more than usual. It indicated to her that someone else had been driving her car, but she said the keys were on their hook as usual when she woke up at 9:15. After she dropped her kids off, she and Richard arrived at Pizza Hut that morning after 10 a.m. at a different location, and nothing was unusual about the rest of the day. But when the two of them heard that Nancy had died, Richard looked at her and said, "I was with you, right?" Donna wasn't so sure. She had a lot to drink and was a heavy sleeper. It was possible that Richard could have taken her car between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m., and she wouldn't have even known it. A corrections officer who worked at the Travis County Jail also testified against Richard. He said that on April 25th, Christopher was helping him serve dinner to other inmates when Richard said, "That's the mother effer that squealed on me." He then threw his drink in Christopher's face, and they started to get into a fight. The corrections officer had to get between them and separate them. On the other hand, Richard's defense said the only evidence connecting him to Nancy's murder was a pubic hair that looked similar to his. This wasn't concrete evidence. Hair comparison isn't an exact science. Richard testified on his own behalf. He sat there in front of this huge crowd wearing a bulletproof vest and said he'd been at Donna's the entire night and the morning when the crime occurred. Jeanette was sitting in the crowd, and she was irate. Richard was just staring at her the entire time, adamant that he had not seen Nancy that morning and that he would never do anything to her. He said the cops were lying and Christopher was lying. Jeanette felt sick that he was maintaining his innocence when there was so much circumstantial evidence against him. Why would the seat of Donna's car be pushed back? Why would Richard know about a .22 caliber gun and a blue apron? After deliberating for 3 hours, the jury found Richard guilty on February 1st. The next day, at a sentencing trial, they decided in 7.5 minutes that Richard would receive a life sentence. One of the jurors, Liz Rowland, was interviewed, and she said that of course, she believed what Christopher told everyone, and she believed they deserved the sentence they were going to get. The jury was being congratulated for putting them behind bars. Nancy's parents, Jeanette and Eddie, felt completely relieved that after 15 months the judicial system worked. Richard was going to jail. But Jeanette reminded the public that this trial was about getting justice for Nancy, and she didn't want Nancy to be remembered by Richard speaking for himself. She wanted people to remember how beautiful Nancy was and how much she loved her family. The week afterward, Christopher Ochoa was sentenced to life in prison for capital murder. The case seemed finished, but in the next few years, more evidence would come out. Bear with me, because this information is wild. That is why I wanted to cover this case. It already seems so unbelievable. Well, you just wait. I know that it's hard with so much information, but I'm telling you, your patience will pay off. This case will stick with you. Let me take you 6 years after Richard and Christopher were put behind bars. Investigator Manny Fuentes was assigned to investigate some very strange letters that were being sent all over the place from a Texas inmate. He was a really bad guy, already serving 3 life sentences for sex crimes and armed robberies. The letters were full of crazy ramblings, which is actually pretty common. There are lots of bored inmates with nothing better to do with their time. This inmate's name was Joseph Marino, and he had apparently been sending letters to different politicians, police stations, and investigators for years. On February 17, 1998, he wrote a letter to George W. Bush, who was the governor of Texas at the time. He received this 4-page handwritten letter that month. This guy was one of the worst. He was sexist, racist, and had a long criminal history. I'm not going to go into it all, but he really wasn't someone that most of us, especially a governor, would give the time of day to. But Detective Fuentes was tasked with giving him his time. I have this letter. I went through it word by word. It starts with the subject line, "Murder Confession." That should get anyone's attention. Then it reads, "Dear Governor Bush, Sir, my name is Akeem Joseph Marino," and then he gives his inmate number and where he's currently confined. He writes that he's serving 3 life sentences plus 3 10-year sentences for crimes committed in Austin, Texas, in both 1988 and 1990. Then he goes on to say that while in Austin in 1988, he also robbed and sexually violated a 20-year-old woman at the Pizza Hut on Arley Lane. This was in late October of 1988 after purchasing the murder weapon via the Austin American-Statesman classified section. The woman's name was Nancy Lena DePriest. I have not been convicted for this crime. I was arrested in El Paso, Texas, where the murder weapon was confiscated by the El Paso Police Department. However, the federal government convicted me on other charges and not Nancy's murder. Apparently, he had now gone through a religious transformation after attending Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous programs in prison. He wanted to come clean about being responsible for Nancy's murder. He said, "I'm 100% responsible." As Detective Fuentes was looking into this, he was told many times by the Austin PD that he was wasting his time. All he had to do was look at Christopher Ochoa's confession. The guys who really did this were already in jail, and he should just ignore this lunatic who was writing these absurd letters. But just to be sure, Fuentes went to visit Christopher in prison that same year, but Christopher absolutely refused to speak to him. His first words were, "I have nothing to say, just let me do my time." It seemed like his colleagues were right, he was wasting his time. But there was something about all this that just seemed off. For one thing, back in 1992, 2 years after both men had been on trial, Detective Polano, remember him, was fired. He had been accused of coercing false confessions and lying on the witness stand, not in Christopher and Richard's trial, but in enough other cases that it was clear he wasn't reliable, and neither was his shoddy police work. Someone had caught him on video beating up a suspect. I mean, if he did this once, there's a strong possibility he'd done it again. Polano faced charges and was then exonerated. Was videotaped violence not enough to convict him? I don't know. I guess not, because Polano went right back to his job, and by 1998, he was still serving on the force. However, this raised Fuentes' suspicions. He wanted to use his own skills to reanalyze this case from scratch, so he went back to square one. Was it true what Akeem said in his letter, that Christopher and Richard were basically arrested for a crime that he committed? Fuentes pulled up Nancy's case files and started examining all the photos taken at the crime scene. He pored over the evidence piece by piece and noticed a few things. One was the shell casing found in the bathroom where Nancy's body had been found. She was not in the hallway where Christopher stated that he shot her, and neither was the shell casing. Why would Christopher move the shell casing to the bathroom? Had it somehow made its way there on its own? It didn't seem likely. Plus, there was something even more telling. The blood spatter. Upon further investigation, Fuentes noticed there was a bucket in the bathroom that had high-velocity blood stains on it, which meant it was nearby when Nancy was shot. So, she was shot in the bathroom, not the hallway. The stains on the hallway wall were not consistent. They were low-velocity stains, most likely from when emergency personnel were trying to either attend to her, or move her, or revive her. That's when Fuentes decided he might be onto something. He went back to Achim's letter, now looking at it with more confidence that it might lead him in the right direction. He called the El Paso PD and referenced the case regarding Achim from 1988. It happened only 2 days after Nancy's murder, and unbelievably, they still had the gun in evidence. He requested it and brought it in for forensic testing. It was also a .22 caliber, the same caliber of bullet recovered from Nancy's head. However, Fuentes dug deeper into Achim's letter, and there was something that stood out. Achim claimed that at the time of his arrest, he literally had the keys to the Pizza Hut in his possession, as well as 2 bank bags with the names of the Pizza Hut and the bank on them. These items were put into his personal property locker in the county jail when he was being processed. And that's crazy to me. Clearly, if you look at these items, they're evidence from a crime. They're not a wallet or personal in nature. But okay, so Achim said these items stayed there for 14 months until his friend Janet Vaugh, for whom he provided an address, picked up all his personal property when he was finally transferred to prison. He said she took it all to his parents' house, where it remained until the day he was paroled in 1990. But he was rearrested for another offense, and that was when his cellmate told him that 2 men had confessed to NY's murder, which just baffled him. He told his cellmate they had the wrong guys. Now, he didn't admit that he did it, but he said he knew the guy who did this, and that was before his spiritual awakening. The letter went on to explain that he had written to the Texas District Attorney's Office multiple times since 1996, and every single letter had been ignored. That is when he wrote to Bush, but the governor's office didn't get back to him either. I mean, at this point, Bush was most likely trying to prepare to run for president, so maybe he was just a little busy. But I know it can take months before you get a response, if you get one at all. Months and months passed, and Achim never got a response, but he never gave up. Achim wrote again, this time to the police. He said in that letter that if they went to his house, they would find all the evidence involved in the crime. This included the bank bags and the handcuffs that had been used to restrain Nancy. But the Austin Police Department was skeptical. Here was this random guy writing them from prison, claiming he was responsible for a case they'd solved years ago. But now that Fuentes was on the case, he sent an officer to Achim's parents' house, and they were able to find everything he had promised. The .22 caliber bullets, the bank bag, which held exactly $150 that was missing from the safe, and a pair of handcuffs, which were sent to the crime lab for DNA testing. What I told you is crazy, but it didn't automatically mean they believed Achim. He could have been involved in the crime with Christopher and Richard. Maybe they made some kind of deal. But the letter had already stated that he was the only one responsible, and he didn't know these other guys. Nevertheless, the Austin PD tried to make a connection. They looked and looked for one. Jail phone records, mail, shared cellmates, but there was nothing. So Fuentes decided to speak with Achim himself. He was brought to the Austin Police Department for an interview. Achim was calm and confident, and he told a very compelling story. He said that on the morning of October 24th, 1988, he was looking for a restaurant to rob. He went around randomly, looking for ones that only had one car in the parking lot before opening hours. That way, there would most likely only be one person inside. He dressed like a repairman, carrying a toolbox and everything, pretending he was there to fix something. That was his ruse. Well, he admits that he first stopped at a restaurant up the street from Pizza Hut called Magic Time Machine. A man came to the door and actually let him inside, but he aborted the mission. He was hoping to find a woman inside alone. He was on a mission. He was seeking revenge on a woman from his past who was white with blonde hair, a security guard that he felt had wronged him. He had promised himself if he found someone that resembled her that day, he would blow her head off. Well, sadly, he found one when he stopped at Pizza Hut. He used the same ruse, and it worked with Nancy. She let him in, and he followed her to the back just as the phone rang. He let her answer it, but as soon as she was done, he asked her to come over to the beverage area because he needed to show her something. That's when he pulled out his gun and told her this was a robbery and to give him all the money in the safe, which she did. Then he forced her at gunpoint into the men's restroom, where he told her to take off all of her clothes. She complied, and he tied her hands behind her back with her bra and made her go back to the storage area, where he confessed to violating her only one time. Before he told her to go back to the men's room, he explained to her that he was going to handcuff her to the plumbing and leave her to be found later. Sadly, when she kneeled down to be handcuffed to the pipe under the sink, Akim said he shot her in the back of the head. She had no idea he was going to do it. She hadn't seen it coming. It was quick, and she didn't beg for her life or say anything. When it was all over, he said that he searched for the shell casing, but in haste, he couldn't find it and didn't want to spend any more time there, so he left it behind and fled. This was a lot to take in, but Fuentes decided to check out the magic time machine story. Sure enough, the manager at the time, Oscar Salas, said that a man did come by that morning. He let him in, he went to the back of the building, and then he just left without saying a word. This was all adding up. Had they had this information from the beginning, they probably wouldn't have believed Christopher and Richard, but this meant that they lied about everything. Why? On top of all this, it turns out George Bush's office admitted that Bush had received this letter. They only ignored it because he claimed that the district attorney's office had been notified. As for why the DA didn't do anything with this evidence, maybe it got lost, but it's unlikely. The state probably didn't want to admit that they had gotten the wrong guys. I mean, that's taking a big hit to admit you got it wrong. After this, Christopher was visited by investigators, but he thought they were going to accuse him of another crime and force another confession. He was afraid that if he said he was innocent, then he would be seen as not having any remorse for Nancy, and the parole board would never consider him for release. They asked him if he was innocent, and he said no, that he and Richard were responsible. But Christopher started to have some hope. In June of 1999, he wrote a letter to the Wisconsin Innocence Project, which took on his case. At this point, the Texas authorities were looking into the case and hoping to actually exonerate both Christopher and Richard. I know I've only been talking about Christopher, and there's a reason for that. Unfortunately, Richard wasn't exactly able to speak with detectives the way that Christopher was, because back on February 27, 1991, less than a year after being incarcerated, Richard was attacked in prison. Another inmate misidentified him as someone they knew, and they tried to kill him. He was kicked in the head multiple times. It was brutal. Richard was taken to the hospital, where he underwent surgery, and they had to remove part of his brain. At 4 a.m., his parents got the call from a chaplain telling them Richard was in the ICU and probably wouldn't make it, that he might only have days to live. But he survived. However, after such a traumatic event, he had permanent brain damage and could not even take care of himself. Surprisingly, he was put back into general population in prison, where he was consistently taken advantage of. He was beaten. He was tortured in many ways that I don't even want to mention. But I'm sure you know what they did to him. He was just rotting away for something he possibly had no involvement in. By the year 2000, DNA technology had advanced a lot, so they took DNA samples from Akim in August of that year. At this point, 12 years had passed, and though DNA processing takes a while, it was a lot more accurate than it used to be. Multiple labs tested the semen samples found at the crime scene, as well as the hair, and they compared it to Christopher and Richard. Again, they were not a match. Christopher and Richard were exonerated. The semen samples didn't match up either. Recall, Christopher's was never really a match, it just couldn't be eliminated. Well, it turns out there were 3 million other people that shared that genetic marker, and the hair did not belong to Richard. As for Akim, his DNA was a match. He was the killer. When the news broke, as you can probably imagine, it was very shocking. Detective Polanco retired. He's the true villain in the story. I mean, I cannot believe that he got away with beating people in interviews, promising they would get the death penalty, and calling himself the devil. Usually law enforcement is on the side of justice, but sometimes these things happen. Not only Nancy and her family were victims of this crime, but Richard and Christopher and their families were too. I understand that it's hard to believe, but people do confess to crimes they did not commit. False confessions are more common than you may think. But didn't Christopher know things about the crime scene? His confession was so detailed. Well, let's remember it was being typed by the investigators, not Christopher, and it wasn't recorded in any way. Christopher said that his confession included intimate details of the crime scene because officers showed him pictures before he made a statement. But that's not all. Christopher explained everything, and it began to make sense. As I briefly explained, he was never in trouble with the law. As a matter of fact, he respected law enforcement. He had the utmost respect for police. He remembers them coming to his school when he was a kid and telling children if they were ever in trouble, they could rely on the cops. Just call 911. Christopher was a good student. He came from a close-knit family and was looking forward to going to community college for 2 years and then transferring to the University of Austin. But he didn't come from money, so he was working at Pizza Hut to save up. He believed the cops were on his side when they brought him in. He had no idea they were considering him a suspect. He was just trying to help. Christopher completely trusted that law enforcement had his best interests in mind, not understanding that they wanted a confession. Polanco and Balaja claimed that they used interview tactics that were commonplace. They weren't doing anything extreme. They were just playing good cop, bad cop to draw a confession out of someone who engaged in sketchy behaviors. But Christopher said he felt trapped. Polanco started yelling and threatening him, telling him he would be executed. We know that Polanco may have been successful at getting confessions, but he wasn't ethical. At one point, Christopher said he asked the woman detective if he could have an attorney, and she said he couldn't have one until he was officially charged, which was a lie. Now maybe Christopher misunderstood what was being said, but knowing that they were using extreme and unethical interview tactics, and that Polanco had a track record of finishing his cases quickly, I kind of have a feeling that the cops were probably in the wrong during this interview. They only cared about getting Christopher to break down. No matter how they got to that result, it wasn't working on Richard, so they went harder on Christopher. Physically too, Polanco allegedly grabbed Christopher's arm and pointed to the spot where veins are located, saying, "This is where the needle's going to go in when they execute you." Polanco said he would be there to watch Christopher's execution. Christopher told them time and time again he didn't do anything, and he begged them to believe him. Many times Polanco was right in his face, enough to smell his breath and feel his spit. He threatened him that he was going to call the DA and charge him with capital murder, and that's when he finally asked them, "What do I have to do to go home?" Polanco said Christopher needed to just make a statement, so that's when Boardman came in and had Christopher sign a blank piece of paper so they could put anything on it that they wanted to, because they already had Christopher's signature. At that point, he didn't know what to believe. He was scared, and from everything that he learned, he thought Richard had killed Nancy. He couldn't believe his best friend would do something so horrible. At one point, he said they tried to record his interview on tape, but Polanco was having trouble. He had to stop the tape anytime Christopher gave an answer he didn't like, so he got too frustrated to continue. That's when they brought in the typewriter. He wanted it to stop, he wanted to go home, so he complied. When his mother, Dora, heard the news, she was heartbroken and confused. No one in his family thought he was capable of something like this. They did not believe it. But as time went on, and things were looking worse for Christopher, especially when his own attorney explained to him that it was best he just took a plea deal to get a lesser sentence, his mom agreed. At one point, Christopher found out she almost had a heart attack and was in the hospital, and he didn't want her to worry, so he took the deal because she had been begging him to do that. Who knows who really came up with everything that was heard at trial? It had been drilled into Christopher. He thought at that point, when even his lawyer gave up on him, this was all he had. When he was initially confessing, he actually thought that once he got a lawyer, they'd smooth it over, or the real evidence would come out at trial. Texas prisons are really tough, and nobody wanted to listen to Christopher. He kept saying he was innocent. At one point, he said he wanted to die. He wrote a letter to his uncle Ronald, and his family was just praying that he wouldn't do anything to himself. His mom said she prayed every day and begged him not to take his life. The truth was that when Christopher found out what happened to Nancy, he was horrified. He couldn't believe that happened to someone who worked at one of the Pizza Huts. But he actually didn't know Nancy personally, and neither did Richard. They were young kids who were morbidly curious, like many others, and they wanted to check out the scene where it happened. They were toasting in her memory, in honor of her, because they did something to her that was misinterpreted. And that's all it took. Christopher was released from prison in January 2000 after 12 years of being behind bars. 2 months later, Richard was released to the care of his family, but sadly, because of the subdural hematoma, he would never again have the quality of life he had before he went to jail. He needed to be cared for by someone else for the rest of his life. However, both Christopher and Richard received multi-million-dollar settlements from Travis County and the city of Austin for their wrongful convictions. I want to know, do you think that makes up for what they went through? There are a lot of opinions on this case. That's the reason I wanted to do this story. I've seen so many comments all over the internet talking about how Christopher deserved to be imprisoned for the rest of his life because he testified against Richard, knowing it was a lie. People think that should be a crime in and of itself, and he was ultimately responsible by extension for Richard's situation. What do you think? I see their point, but we have to remember that Christopher went through 20 hours of interrogation. That's not easy, especially for someone with English as a second language. It's hard to say whether he even confessed at all. It was Polanco and Balaja putting words in his mouth and then typing statements themselves. Even Nancy's mother has forgiven Christopher and Richard, but especially Christopher. Not right away, though. She probably felt like many of the people I just referenced, who truly seemed to have hatred toward Christopher. Jeanette found out through her family that Christopher and Richard's convictions were overturned. She had just gotten married and was at work when she received a phone call from her brother-in-law telling her to turn on the TV. She turned on the TV at work, and there was a Texas district attorney saying that Ackham was Nancy's murderer. Jeanette actually collapsed. She was livid. She was so mad they hadn't called her. All the feelings of devastation and grief boiled up again. She called the DA's office and argued with one of the assistants, insisting that they already had the right people and now they were letting them go. Then she called Christopher and Richard's lawyers. Both of them acted defensive, but Jeanette insisted she didn't care what the verdict was. She just wanted the truth. Well, the truth was they made a mistake. They told Jeanette that the two men were innocent. Jeanette, of course, couldn't call Richard, but she did call Christopher. She talked to him in prison and apologized to him and his family for all the suffering they went through. Of course, it wasn't Jeanette's fault, but she, like a lot of other people, believed the Texas judicial system was fair. But then she realized sometimes it's not. On January 16, 2001, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the convictions of Christopher and Richard. Jeanette attended the hearings, and when Christopher walked free, she pulled him aside and asked, "Why did you confess?" He said that in that confession room there was no food, no water, no sunlight, and no hope, and it broke him. He didn't have the courage to defend himself and his friend, and the guilt ate him alive. Jeanette now wanted to find out what actually happened. She went to visit Akim in prison. There she asked, "Why did you kill Nancy?" He told her that he had heard voices in his head since he was a child, and these voices were telling him to make a human sacrifice. He said she didn't fight him. Nancy was turned away and would have never seen the bullet coming. Jeanette was outraged that she and her family had spent years thinking Nancy had begged for her life for over an hour, as two perpetrators tried to take away her dignity time and time again. Jeanette had reoccurring nightmares about the amount of pain Nancy must have been in, but now knowing that this story had been created and exaggerated by police, where is the justice? What happened to Nancy was horrible, but Jeanette still felt a tiny bit of relief, knowing that not everything that happened occurred the way she thought it had. When the DA's office asked Jeanette if she wanted to pursue the death penalty for Occam, she refused. She didn't want Occam's blood on her hands. In fact, Jeanette spent the rest of her life as an activist advocating against the death penalty. She converted to Catholicism and believed that a life for a life is not justice. Justice is having to sit and suffer for your consequences the rest of your life. And I want to know what you think of the death penalty. It's definitely a polarizing topic. You're welcome to come to whatever conclusion you want about Christopher's innocence or guilt in all of this, but at the very least, I do try my best to have empathy and understanding, which I know isn't easy. But Christopher did lose years of his own life, and he said, "Sometimes I think about Richard, and I feel very bad because I didn't have the courage to face up to whoever might come to me so that he wouldn't go to prison." I want to mention that, but in the settlements, Richard received over $10 million, and Christopher received $5 million. He gave a big portion of his payout to Richard and his family. But of course, the damage was already done. Remember that juror I told you about? When they found out, they felt awful about being a part of all this. But she admitted that the evidence was very convincing, and the DA even made a statement. She said she truly had no reason not to believe Christopher and the confession. She would have never prosecuted him if she had any doubt, but she wasn't armed with everything we know now. I wonder how many cases like this exist. The Texas Rangers began investigating Sergeant Borman, Balaja, and Polanco for their role in Christopher's false confession. The investigators didn't follow up on leads in the first days of their search. They didn't interview all of the witnesses, which is why we didn't get testimony from Pizza Hut bosses like Donna's supervisor. They had already jumped to conclusions and formed their own story, and there was little to no documentation of any of these interviews. Finally, in closing, Christopher's confession included a ton of details that police knew were wrong. They never corrected him in his confession. He did say several things that only the police or the perpetrator would know, but that's because he was fed all of that information. Unfortunately, because nobody had documented Polanco and Balaja's good cop, bad cop routine, the investigation into their misconduct was unable to be determined. They couldn't tell whether Christopher was intimidated into giving a confession, and none of these detectives got into trouble. Occam's trial was in October of 2022, and he pleaded not guilty by insanity, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He was sentenced to life in prison, on top of the 3 other life sentences for the murder of Nancy DePriest. After all this, Christopher actually went to law school at the University of Wisconsin, where he is now an attorney. In 2006, he and Jeanette testified in California that all police interrogations should be videotaped. Jeanette said, "I've heard lots of people say I would never do that. I would never confess to something I didn't do. How do you know what you would do if you were in that interrogation room with the man they call El Diablo?" False confessions happen all the time, not only from people suffering from mental illness or vulnerability, but people like Christopher, who are intelligent and have good intentions. As for Nancy, her daughter Slivia is now in her late 30s. Sadly, Jeanette passed away in 2019 at 69 years old after her battle with lung cancer, and Richard died in 2021 following his own battle with cancer at age 50. Todd and the rest of the family are left with their memories of Nancy, the hardworking, dedicated, sweet, funny, and bright young woman that she was. It hurts me that so many people suffered due to negligence and the choices of an absolute monster. But I have hope, knowing that people like Nancy exist, and we can honor their stories and remember them for who they were before their lives were robbed from them. Some cases are so dark and disturbing that they defy understanding for those of us with compassion and a sense of morality. Yet, there are individuals among us who seem entirely devoid of humanity. This is one of those stories, one that will leave you wondering why and questioning whether it's possible to ever truly know someone, as some minds are capable of unimaginable evil. One Friday evening in a peaceful London neighborhood, a young woman left for what was meant to be a short walk to meet her date for dinner. It was a routine part of her life, an act that everyone deserves to feel safe doing. But this time was different. This time she never made it back home. Before we get into it, let me take you into the heart of London, but not the bustling center you might imagine. No, we're actually heading to a place called Kidbrooke Village, a hidden gem nestled in southeast London's royal borough of Greenwich. Now, it's a much sought-after address, but this charming village was once a post-war wasteland. It was a relic of World War II, and the site used to serve as a base for the Royal Air Force before laying dormant until the late 1960s, when it was transformed into the infamous Fair Estate, which was an urban housing complex. It consisted of 74 blocks, ranging from 2-story houses to 13-floor towers, and it had a lot of promise. However, it ended up becoming a symbol of failed urban planning when it began to deteriorate, and people started to leave. By 2006, it was completely abandoned, leaving it looking like a post-apocalyptic ghost town. That is until 2009, when a new vision for the area emerged from its desolate foundation. A £1 billion regeneration project breathed life into this barren land. They demolished everything, and by 2010, Kidbrooke Village was born. It's a self-contained, idyllic blend of modern living and natural beauty. It sounds like I'm doing an ad, but it is now a thriving community with parks, ponds, and plenty of green spaces. At its heart lies Car Park, an 86-acre oasis perfect for family fun. It's a popular place for picnics, bike rides, and playing outdoors, especially with its close to 3-acre designated playground. Kidbrooke Village has everything, so residents don't really need to leave. It has 2 on-site primary schools with really good ratings, and the village center consists of residents-only gyms, a Sainsbury's supermarket, as well as a 24-hour corner service in the retail hub. Now, it doesn't have a bustling nightlife, but there are a few cute pubs and restaurants within walking distance from the townhomes and apartments nearby. At this point, I think you get the idea. Modern suburban living, a great place to raise children, but with the excitement and opportunities of London. Well, now that I've set the stage for you, I'll let you know that when this case took place, it was said that there had not been a murder in this location in over 50 years. That is, until an emergency call came in to the Metropolitan Police Department on the evening of September 18, 2021. It was around 5:30 p.m. when a local Kidbrooke resident explained to the emergency operator that he'd been walking his dog through Car Park when he got to the backside of the youth community center called One Space. His dog began sniffing in a more erratic manner toward an area of tall grass off the path of the sidewalk. At first glance, the man thought his dog had found a potato sack in the bushes. I know, why would a potato sack be there? But this was what he thought his mind would recognize. As he got closer, he realized it was a person that he actually believed had been simply resting or even sleeping. But as he got even closer, he noticed it appeared to be a young woman. He could see she was wearing a pair of sparkly boots and a black outfit, so he called out to her, believing that maybe she had a few too many drinks the night before and passed out. However, he did think it was strange that it looked like she was covered in leaves, so he crouched down and began to talk to her. She wasn't responding, and that's when he explained he brushed off some of those leaves and saw a lot of flies hovering around, which was his first clue that something wasn't right. Still, his mind wasn't registering what he was looking at. Upon further inspection, the position that she was in didn't seem natural. Her boots were facing the sky, her neck was almost turned all the way back, and then he noticed the blood. Still, he attempted to find a sign of life by feeling her neck for a pulse, but there wasn't one, and she clearly wasn't breathing. He knew that he needed to call 999, but his phone was dead, So he ran to a person nearby who had been in the same area, looking through the grass for a gold necklace they had lost. He told them he had just found a body and asked if he could borrow their phone. As you can probably imagine, this was an extremely shocking and traumatizing experience for these two residents. To find a body in a popular, well-traveled park in this very safe, close-knit community. Anyone could have stumbled upon the scene. There were so many children playing in this area and so many families enjoying the beautiful weather that weekend. It didn't seem real that a person was lying dead right there in the middle of the park. Of course, the police acted fast. Senior Metropolitan Police Detective Inspector Neil John and Detective Inspector Joe Geedy were leading this investigation, and as soon as the team got on the scene, they began cordoning off the area where the body had been found. They put up a blue tent around the remains so that onlookers would not be able to catch a glimpse, or worse, take pictures. It was clear that the woman had suffered a violent death and that they were dealing with a homicide. Most of the injuries that could be seen during the preliminary examination were to her head. A crime scene manager was called in. They're responsible for the forensic response to major crime scenes. What's important to note, and we don't always think about this, is that when you're dealing with an outdoor crime scene, it's much different than dealing with finding a body, let's say, at a house, for example. When the crime scene is inside a building or a home, all the evidence is usually contained within the walls of that location, and investigators don't have to worry so much about things being contaminated due to inclement weather, for instance. The person they find deceased usually has some connection to where they were found. Maybe they lived there, or maybe the person who did this to them lived there. Those connections are a lot easier to make than finding someone outside and not knowing who they are, where they're from, and how they got there. There's going to be a lot of questions. No matter where a body is found, there are a lot more unknowns when you're dealing with a crime scene outside. Did they die there? Were they placed there after they were killed? Of course, the condition of their body could be worse because of the elements. The heat, maybe the rain, maybe insect activity. All of those things compound an already very complicated situation. The forensics team noticed the same things that I told you the police had observed. It was clear this woman had suffered from head injuries. She had definitely been beaten with something, but there was no weapon nearby. However, there were other important aspects in relation to her body that told a story. The body is the first place you're going to find a lot of clues about the crime. So in this case, the first thing investigators were looking at was the body itself, and then they were going to work outward. She was partially nude. Her top had been pulled all the way up, exposing her bra. Her skirt was also pulled up, and she wasn't wearing anything on the bottom except for her boots. Her body was positioned in a very provocative manner, in a sexually suggestive way. She was face up, her hands were in both of her coat pockets, and her legs were spread apart and positioned upward. She had been covered in leaves in a sloppy attempt to conceal her remains, but there was one thing that stood out right away as very odd. There wasn't a lot of blood in the location where the body was found, even though she had very significant injuries. Investigators knew this meant she probably was attacked somewhere else and then brought to this location. Maybe she was moved so that she would be more visible to the public, to shock onlookers. Maybe, especially with the way she was positioned, it seemed like this was a way to shame her, to humiliate her even in death. Or this could have been a way so that she was found easier. They don't know, but now they have to find out where she was before she was brought there, which meant that their crime scene was about to get a lot bigger, and that can make it even more difficult to search for clues. The easy part in this case was actually identifying the victim. In most cases, that takes some time, but her passport was inside her coat pocket. The badly beaten woman that was found deceased in Car Park was 28-year-old Sabina Nessa. Of course, when she was identified, the very next step was to contact her family as soon as possible. You don't want them to find out about this on the news, through media. You want them to be informed properly. But you also need to gather as much information from her family as possible, because maybe her family knew why she was in that location, or who she was with last, or if there was anyone who might want to harm her. It's difficult to quantify the devastation Sabina's family felt when they were notified of her death. Her parents had immigrated to the UK for a better and safer life for their family, and now they were about to learn their daughter had been murdered. Before I go there, let me tell you who Sabina Nessa was. Her father, Abdar Ralph, and her mother, Sabina Nessa, arrived in London from Bangladesh back in 1980. Her father found a job working as a chef, and soon the couple would welcome 4 daughters. Sabina was the oldest. She was born in North London in 1991. And then just under a year later, Sabina was born on October 23, 1992, in Greenwich. At this point, the family moved to a red brick semi-detached council house on a quiet cul-de-sac in the town of Sandy, which is located in central Bedfordshire. 10 years after Sabina was born, 2 more daughters would complete their family. Sabina's parents still lived in the same home when this tragedy occurred. They raised their daughters there, and they even became property owners by purchasing that home for £35,000. Since they'd been in the neighborhood for so long, they were very well known, very well liked, and respected by their close-knit community. Everyone loved the Nessa girls. They were familiar faces in this area, known to be lovely young women who came from a really good family. Sabina and her older sister, Sabina, were very close. They had a very strong bond that continued throughout their adulthood. When they were little, the 2 of them shared a bedroom, and they loved to pretend they were teachers. They would actually go back and forth, with one pretending they were the student and the other the teacher, and then they would switch. Sabina always took her role as a teacher very seriously. It was her nature to want to help others. The girls' close-knit family's Muslim faith was important to them, and Sabina would often raise money to give to individuals that were experiencing poverty back in her parents' homeland in Bangladesh. But beyond that, Sabina wanted to make sure she learned as much as she could because she saw the hardships her parents faced, being unable to speak and write in English. Sabina actually made sure that she was able to step in for her mom and dad. She was the one that would deal with anything that came to replying to letters or answering to administrators at her school. She would interpret for her parents so that they were informed about what was going on. Sabina valued education from a very young age because she knew it would help her have a better life one day. She was known to be hungry for knowledge, and she would spend all of her extra money buying books. She always had a book with her, and when technology advanced, Sabina would enjoy reading the news on her phone, which was one of her daily routines. The sisters also enjoyed nature. They loved riding their bikes together in the park, and they had a lot of free space to play outside where they lived. Sabina was never happier than when she was outside. She loved animals as well. First, the girls had some birds as pets, and then they got 3 cats that they absolutely adored. Sabina just had such a caring nature about her. She was very lovable. She was also an excellent student. She got straight A's in school, and she enjoyed all of her subjects, but she really liked English and math. After Sabina graduated high school in 2011, the pretend games that she used to play with her sister became her reality. She decided she wanted to be a teacher. She was the kind of person who wanted to make a difference in the world by inspiring the minds of children. But it didn't end there. She dreamed of being a head teacher one day and going to teach a language to children abroad in Dubai. She loved kids. As a matter of fact, her loving and caring side made her a great aunt to her sister Sabina's children. When Sabina got married and moved to London, Sabina followed not too long afterward. She didn't want to be far from her closest sibling. They were like best friends. When Sabina moved to London, she enrolled at Greenwich University and studied sociology, graduating in 2014. Her personal tutor during her degree courses, Dr. Luis Owen Zukan, said that Sabina loved learning and she didn't have a bad bone in her body, and she was looking forward to Sabina making a difference in her future pupils' lives one day. After completing her undergraduate degree, Sabina went on to do a master's in teaching at the University of Bedfordshire. She wasn't all work and no fun though. She was actually very outgoing and social. Out of the Nessa family, she was the only extrovert. She was loud, silly, opinionated, but kind-hearted, and she was always making jokes. Her nieces would describe her as crazy, but what they meant was that she had a lot of energy and random outbursts of laughter. She spent a lot of time with them when they were little toddlers. She absolutely loved fashion, so she would introduce them to her favorite clothes and makeup. Sabina loved to shop. She liked buying makeup, purses, and shoes, and enjoyed getting dressed up and looking pretty. And she was very pretty. She had long dark hair, olive skin, and striking dark soulful eyes, and sometimes she liked to wear light-colored contact lenses. She definitely stood out in a crowd, not only because of her looks, but because of the energy she brought with her wherever she went. She was described as being full of fun and a beautiful, kind soul. A girly girl, generous, funny, and determined, and that sums her up in words. But to really know Sabina was to truly love her, and her students loved her. Yes, she did end up becoming a teacher. After finishing her master's degree, Sabina obtained a qualification from Cambridge to teach English as a foreign language. She was well on her way to achieving all of her goals. For Sabina, life was good. Just a year after finishing her education, she landed her dream job in 2020. She became a Year 1 teacher at Rushy Green Primary School in Leash. She had a class full of 5- and 6-year-old students, and she treated each one of them as if they were unique. For instance, if a student liked chess, she would start a chess club so that the other kids could get involved in what that student liked. She wanted all of her students to feel loved and included. According to her family, friends, and colleagues, Sabina took her first teaching job in this low-income area of London because she was well aware of the many challenges and discrimination children face. She knew that there was going to be a lot of suffering going on in the world, and she wanted to try her best to make a difference in these children's lives. She wanted them to tear down any barriers of disadvantage they may have so that they could reach their full potential. And even though Sabina had only been at the school a short amount of time, she made a big impact. Head teacher Lisa Williams described Sabina as a brilliant teacher and absolutely dedicated to her students. She would come to school early before anyone else, and she treated her classroom like her home. Lisa said Sabina would often buy flowers on her way to school and then display them in her classroom so everyone could enjoy them. And when the school chefs, Luke and Rob, began growing a few herbs and vegetables in the garden on the school grounds, Sabina was the first teacher to take her class to go have a look. She was always involved in everything that was going on with everyone. She chose to eat lunch with her students every day without fail, and she wouldn't just sit there watching them quietly. She would get involved. She would talk to them, encourage them, and she was part of their lives in more ways than just being their teacher. However, as passionate as Sabina was in ensuring other people's children were cared for, family always came first. There was a time when one of her nephew's parents could not afford lunch for him, and Sabina, discreet but generous, paid for his food so that he could eat with his classmates and not feel left out. Sabina always made time for her family, no matter how busy she got. She would speak with Jabina all the time, at least a few times a week, if not more. She still made time to visit her parents' home and beers. She would never come empty-handed either. She would burst through those doors with many shopping bags full of items, including flowers, clothes, and presents. Sabina was a bright light, selfless, always smiling, especially when talking about her students. When she visited with her family, she would share the latest thing that one of the kids in her class said or did, or even a picture they had drawn for her. She was so proud of each of them. Sabina lived in an apartment in Kidbrook Village, off of AEL Road. I'm going to be showing this on the map if you're watching. If not, it's quite all right. I always explain everything. These apartments were part of that regeneration plan I told you about that began in 2010. They're luxury-style apartments that come fully furnished with modern designer kitchens and bathrooms, hardwood floors, mood lighting, and spacious balconies overlooking the beautiful landscaping and green areas throughout Kidbrook. They even have a concierge service and an on-site gym, everything you would need. Sabina lived with her roommate, and she was very proud of their living space. She would bring fresh flowers home and put them around the apartment. Sabina loved the nearby Cater Park. There was an entrance that was only a couple of minutes' walk from her building, and she would go there all the time to enjoy the outdoors. She also enjoyed exploring new places with her friends. Living in London meant plenty of nightlife attractions and restaurants, and Sabina enjoyed all it had to offer. She was also nearing 30 years old and thinking about her future and having kids of her own one day, but she never got the chance to experience that because she never made it to age 29. Her body was found just a month before her next birthday and just 200 feet from her front door, lying lifeless in the sprawling Cater Park. Now let's jump back to the investigation. Authorities were doing their best to locate Sabina's next of kin to make that death notification. Meanwhile, they expanded this crime scene and cordoned off a larger portion of the park. They brought in drones and began combing the area for evidence, but they weren't really finding anything significant by doing the normal line search of the park. Sabina's body was found on the backside of the One Space Community Youth Center. There's a skate park and meeting areas, and One Space is a Christian community center on the edge of the Kidbrook Village development. The building has a cafe, as well as offices where young people could meet up. At this point, they didn't know when Sabina had been killed, so they began looking for witnesses who may have seen something out of the ordinary. At the same time, investigators began looking for nearby cameras that might have captured the attack on video. Luckily, since this was a newer development, this park had a number of cameras along the pathways, so they went about obtaining all of the CCTV footage they could. Sabina's body was then removed and taken to the mortuary for a post-mortem examination. It didn't take long for people to notice all of the commotion that was happening in the middle of their community. It was quite obvious by the blue tent in the park that someone had died there, and of course, everyone wanted to know what was going on in such a popular and well-traveled area where kids and families walk every single day. Soon, there was a lot of buzz within the community. People were walking up, they were asking officers what happened. But of course, the authorities remained tight-lipped until they had more information and had notified Sabina's loved ones. All night, officers stood guard outside the park perimeter so that no evidence would be disturbed, and by the next day, Sabina's mother and father, as well as a couple of her sisters, had been notified about the heartbreaking news. Even though Sabina was so close and had infrequent communication with her sister, she had no idea Sabina was missing until she got the news that her body had been found. Can you imagine? Her phone rang in the morning on Sunday, September 19th, the morning after Sabina had been discovered. Sabina was busy with her kids, so her husband answered, and she actually thought that it was going to be Sabina calling. But instead, it was one of their other sisters to inform them that Sabina was dead. When Sabina's husband relayed the news, she was in shock. She said her whole world fell apart, and she later said she couldn't have imagined the horror of that call. Sabina and her husband immediately left their home and made their way to their parents' house in Bedfordshire. They didn't have much information up to this point. The only thing they knew was that Sabina had been found deceased. While they were on their way, Sabina was so desperate for information about what happened to her sister that she was frantically conducting Google searches from her phone. The only information she was able to find was that the body of a young woman had been found close to where Sabina lived, and at that point, she made her husband pull the car over to the side of the road. She began yelling and saying, "Could this be Sabina?" She described the journey to her parents' house as horrendous. Even when she and her husband arrived, the wait wasn't over. It took another hour for the police to meet them there, and Sabina said that this was the longest hour of their lives. When the authorities did arrive, they gave her family even more bad news. Not only had Sabina been found deceased, but she had also been murdered. As you can imagine, her parents were absolutely devastated and beside themselves with grief. They were inconsolable, and Sabina's father, it's so sad, went door to door in their neighborhood to deliver the news in person about the death of his daughter to all their neighbors. I can't imagine how horrible this poor family must have felt. You do not think that something like this will ever happen to someone so close to you, and that's exactly what Sabina said, that she never thought that they'd be going through something like this. Who would have wanted this kind young woman dead? That's what everyone wanted and needed to know. Investigators had to work backward to find out what Sabina was doing before she was killed. So the next investigators had to work backward to find out what Sabina was doing before she was killed. So the next person they wanted to interview was Sabina's roommate. This is when some context is finally added to Sabina's story. Her roommate told investigators that on Friday night, September 17th, Sabina was going on a first date with a guy that she met earlier that year. They had plans to meet at a local bar and restaurant called Depot. Here in the US, we would actually pronounce this as Depot, but it's in an area of Kidbrook called Pegler Square, where all the other shops, restaurants, and businesses are located. It's a nice modern establishment with booths outside in the beer garden, so you can enjoy a meal and a drink under the night sky. Inside, there's a full bar and lots of cozy couches and booths and tables to sit at. Sabina's roommate said that she had gotten all glammed up, wanting to look her best in anticipation of her night out. She was excited to be finally meeting up with this guy that she had been talking to after their friendship had turned into something more recently. Investigators asked if Sabina seemed nervous about this meetup, and her roommate said no, not nervous. She was happy about seeing him. However, she was running late. On Fridays, the depot closes at 11 p.m., and they stop serving food at 9:30. Sabina was still at her apartment when her date texted her a little before 8:30 via WhatsApp, letting her know he was already at the depot, and he asked where she was. She told him that she was just about to leave, and that was around 8:32 p.m. Now it's obvious that Sabina was running behind, and she wasn't driving that night since she knew she might have a few drinks. The walk from her place to the depot via the main roadway would have only taken roughly 12 minutes. However, she wasn't found on the main road. She was found inside the park. If she had cut through the park, it would have shaved off at least a few minutes. Considering the investigators now realized that Sabina didn't want to keep her date waiting, they assumed she took a shortcut through the park. Someone either followed her, crossed her path, or they knew that she would be there, and they took that opportunity to attack and kill her. But it still didn't make sense. The thing is, this wasn't typical for Sabina. Her roommate explained that she was very cautious, and she even mentioned in the past that she was nervous about being in that park at night, even though it was in a safe area. She would rather take the long way anytime she was going to Pegler Square. She was never able to explain exactly why she got a bad vibe from Cater Park at night. Maybe it was the looming shadows of the tall trees, or maybe it was intuition about the role that this area would later play in her future. We will never know, but on this occasion, she must have made a compromise. Her roommate told investigators that she became worried later that night when Sabina had not returned to their apartment. She began texting her, but not getting an answer, and she said it wasn't like her not to reply to messages. She also told investigators that she never thought something like this could happen to her, and she no longer feels safe living there. Many people would feel the same way once the word got out about Sabina's murder. It was still only a couple of days after she had been found, so the information provided to the public was sparse. The night of Sabina's murder, the London sunset was at 7:10 p.m., so it would have already been dark when Sabina left her apartment. But even at that hour, there would have been people in the park, some doing the same thing Sabina was doing, taking a shortcut to bars or restaurants, or making their way home from work. So maybe someone saw something. Of course, the next person investigators wanted to speak with was Sabina's date, a man that they found out was 10 years older than her, and he might have been the last person to have contact with her. They actually arrested him under suspicion of murder, and they held him for questioning because 90% of women are killed by someone they know, so they started there. But to cut to the chase, it was clear that this man was not involved, so he was free to go. However, they had a better lead, an eyewitness. It wasn't a person, it was CCTV footage. London is one of the most surveilled cities in the world, with recent estimates suggesting that there are between 600,000 to close to 1 million cameras in the city. Many of these cameras are operated by businesses or private entities, which can make it hard to gain access to them. But in this case, the community in the immediate area was outraged when they found out a woman had been brutally murdered just steps from her front door in a park that was considered safe. Several camera owners actually submitted footage to investigators. They had dashboard cameras, doorbell cameras, and security footage. Investigators had already accessed the park's CCTV footage from the area right near where Sabina's body was found. And even though it is newer equipment, we know these videos are notoriously grainy and of bad quality. And this footage was no exception. But it was all they had. They began looking at it right after 8:30 p.m. on Friday night. And hauntingly, they soon realized that Sabina's entire murder was captured on video. Although they couldn't make out any characteristics of the person who killed her, because the position of the camera was overhead, they couldn't see facial features, ascertain ethnicity, age, or even the color of their clothing. They couldn't make an identification, but it appeared to be a male subject. But now they've answered one question. They know how Sabina was killed. I'm going to warn you, this is very brutal and shocking. Now, of course, they never released the actual footage, but the official reports have described it in detail. First, they were able to identify Sabina from the description her roommate gave them of what she was wearing that night: a dark top, a skirt, tights, a coat, and sparkly boots. Through the various cameras, they spot Sabina crossing a small bridge from Astel Road near her apartment complex in the park. She continued to walk on the footpath. Next, she crossed over Cambert Way and continued to walk on the main sidewalk through the park. That's when the camera captured a hooded figure that emerged from under the trees. He walked in her direction and actually crossed her path. He looked straight at her as she continued to make her way towards the direction of the depot. The attacker kept walking away from her. It was as though he was looking around to make sure no one was close by. Then he quickly turned back towards Sabina's direction and looked her way, probably making sure that that area was clear as well. Then he ran back to where Sabina was at a very rapid pace, approaching her from behind with something in his hand. Right when he was on her heels, she probably heard his footsteps because she started to turn her head behind her, and that's when he began a frenzied attack on this poor woman. It was just blow after blow in very quick succession, again and again and again, striking her in the head and face repeatedly without warning. Sabina was completely caught off guard, but she did attempt to defend herself. Sadly, she was no match for how ferocious this beating was. The investigators slowed the video down and counted 34 strikes to Sabina's head. 34. Finally, Sabina collapsed right over a park bench. She appeared to be unconscious at this point, and the perpetrator literally threw this poor girl over his shoulder and carried her toward that area that was not within the view of the cameras. It's up a bank and covered with tall grass and several trees, and for the next 10 minutes, there's no sign of Sabina or her attacker. But then, only he re-emerges from the area where Sabina's body was ultimately found. He makes his way back to that bench and begins picking up pieces of the weapon that he used to harm Sabina. It had broken during this attack. That's the force he used. It wasn't clear what this item was at the time, but then the attacker is seen going back to where Sabina was taken off camera, and he's gone for another 10 minutes. There's no way to know what he was doing to her in that 20 minutes that the cameras didn't catch his actions, but there are clues, and it's not good. After that second 10-minute period off camera, he returned to the bench a second time and took out what appeared to be wet wipes. He began wiping down the bench where Sabina had fallen. Clearly, this man knew a thing or two about forensics because he was manipulating this crime scene. He was trying to get rid of any evidence of him or Sabina being in that location. But now that investigators know where the murder took place, they made that their new focus. They swabbed the bench and the surrounding area for blood, DNA, and dusted for any fingerprints that may have been left behind. Because they knew what Sabina was wearing before the attack, They were also able to conclude that the killer removed her tights as well as her underwear because she was not wearing either of those items when she was found. However, what struck them as very odd was the fact that the attacker would have had to remove her boots to take off the underwear and tights, but Sabina was found with her boots on both her feet. Therefore, this pervert took his time to put them back on her after what he did to her. With the way that she was posed, it would have enabled him to have full, intimate access to her. According to detectives, there didn't seem to be any other reason to remove those lower items of clothing, exposing her top half and leaving her legs open, unless there had been sexual conduct, especially because he took that clothing with him from the scene, most likely to avoid there ever being a trace of his DNA being found on them. Either that, or investigators suggested he could have taken them as trophies. But considering they watched him clean up the scene, they believed it was the former theory, a sexually motivated crime to take advantage of a beautiful woman who was walking all alone at night. He targeted her. He was watching, waiting, stalking that park, looking for prey. They now believe that this could actually be a random attack, and that this man may not have had any connection with Sabina, but they couldn't be sure. After the savage attack, the man is seen pulling his hood back over his head and casually walking away around 8:56 p.m. He could have gone anywhere, because once he walked out of the south side of the cameras, they weren't sure in which direction he left. This park is pretty big, with many different ways to come and go. The CCTV in the park doesn't cover every nook and cranny, just the main path. So they wondered, did this man walk here or drive? Does he live nearby? Was he casing this area for a while? They don't know, but they want to know which way he went so they could pull CCTV footage from that area. They want to narrow this down, otherwise they will be spending hours upon hours scouring through a number of videos. Time is of the essence. They have a violent killer on the loose who's likely to strike again or get away with this. The next step was to look at more CCTV footage from the areas around the park and the surrounding buildings and businesses, and then to keep moving outward until they found something. They knew very little about the killer's physical appearance, but they were going to try very hard to locate anyone who was in that location on the night that this happened and went through that park. Then, there was this other officer who was dedicated to combing through that park footage. It took him 7 days, but he finally noticed something. It actually ended up being one of the biggest breaks in this entire case. Yet it was something that everyone else missed, except for him. Moments after the killer walked off camera, there was a flash of light that peeked through the darkness. The flash appeared to be coming from an object the killer was holding. Could it be a phone? They weren't sure. You might be wondering why this is important. Well, because now they know what direction he was leaving the park. That, coupled with the time frame they have, allows them to focus on the cameras in that direction, in that area, which appeared to be an entrance off of Pegler Square. The investigators scour CCTV footage from stores and businesses in that area, looking for anyone coming and going around the time before and after the attack. A lot of work went into this. Detectives did hundreds and hundreds of hours piecing so much together to connect all the dots and catch a killer. On one of the cameras, they see a car arrive at Pegler Square at 7:41 p. that same night, so about 50 minutes before Sabina had even left her apartment. I'm going to show it to you on this map how close it was to the park. It's just across the street, and the car was around this area right here. It pulls in and parallel parks. It's the proximity to the park that makes this car stand out. However, I learned that London has ANPR cameras on all their roadways. ANPR is short for automatic number plate recognition. So as drivers make their way around town, their license plate is recorded, which I think is pretty cool. Investigators go and pull all this footage and records from the nearest ANPR camera, but it's just their luck that it was not working properly that night, so it did not record this vehicle's license plate number. That has to be so frustrating, because just when you think you have this big lead, you have nothing. But at least they could see this car. It was a light color, maybe beige, silver, or white, and there were enough characteristics to know it was a Nissan. So they have a Nissan expert come in, take a look at the footage, and they're able to determine, from the tires, the rims, the headlight style, the make, model, and the year of the vehicle, that it was a newer Nissan Micra, only about a year old. Meanwhile, another camera picked up something else that investigators believed was very relevant to this case. They think it could be an image of the killer after he fled the scene. It's footage from Pegler Square, right after the attack. The video shows a balding man who looked like he had a lighter complexion, wearing a black hoodie, light-colored pants, and black shoes with a thick white sole. He's also carrying something peculiar in his hands, and it appears to be a red object. As he walks into frame, he's looking around him and behind him as though he's checking to make sure no one's around, and then he pulls his hood up over his head. Kind of exactly what the killer did on camera when he was leaving the park. Several minutes later, another camera in this vicinity picked up the same man as he got into that vehicle that I showed you, the one parked on the side of the road, and then he sped away from the area. At this point, the police released still shots of this man and the car driving away. They confirm it's a silver Nissan Micra, and they asked the public for tips. Detective Chief Superintendent Trevor Ellery held a press conference about a week after Sabina was murdered. It was on September 23rd, right outside the park, where her body was found. By now, the news of Sabina's murder had spread, and the public was outraged. They wanted answers. Detective Ellery was pleading with the public to come forward if they were in the area that Friday night and saw anything. He said, "Sabina, we believe, was walking from her home address. Her journey would have seen her walk through Kerr Park, and we believe as she walked through the park she was approached by an individual and fatally attacked. Sabina's body was sadly found by members of the public around 5:30 p.m. the following day. As anyone who lives here will know, Kerr Park is well used by the community, and we're appealing for anyone who was here on Friday evening and who thinks they saw anything unusual to come forward. Maybe you saw someone acting strangely inside the park or running away from it. If you were in the area, please think back and let us know if you have any information. You will see that we have an extensive crime scene in place, and we expect it to be here for the next couple of days." It wasn't just the brutal circumstances of Sabina's death that came as a shock to this community. Sabina's murder came just a few months after another young woman named Sarah Everard, a 33-year-old marketing executive, was killed by Wayne Cousins, an off-duty police officer who had falsely arrested her for pretending that she had breached COVID-19 regulations. Instead of bringing her to the station, he drove her 80 miles away, forced himself upon her, strangled her to death, and then later burned her body and disposed of her remains in a nearby pond. Sarah's death had made headline news both nationally and internationally due to the fact that she was simply walking along the street, minding her own business when she was killed. There was a significant group of citizens who were outspoken about the lack of safety for women and girls in London. When Sarah was killed, an organization called Reclaim These Streets was formed to hold a vigil for her and all women affected by male violence. They called for social change. Women should not be afraid to walk alone. They should be allowed to be free to walk the streets without being in fear for their lives. But as most women know, the real reality is, we are afraid. We're taught to be cautious, not to wear anything revealing, to travel in groups, all because men want us for their pleasure and then want to kill us and discard us like trash when they're finished with us, just like so many other women. Women like Sarah and now Sabina and countless others. Another aspect of Sabina's case that bothered her family and the public was that her murder did not attract the same media attention as Sarah's. There was definitely a disparity in the media coverage, and some people claimed it was because Sabina wasn't white, like Sarah was. I have to tell you, there is some truth to this. Missing white woman syndrome is real. It's the media's bias against missing people of color. They just do not get the same amount of media coverage, and therefore their cases are not talked about as much or even known at all. The syndrome also encompasses a disproportionate media attention to females who are young, attractive, white, and upper middle class. It had been a week, and social media was finally starting to react to Sabina's murder, with some people wondering why they were just now becoming aware of such a brutal killing of yet another innocent woman. Celebrities began weighing in, with Jamila Jamil, Emma Barnett, and Tracy Ann Oberman among them. Jamila posted, "I don't want to hear more public warnings about women not walking in parks in the evening. I'm tired of women being burdened with treating the symptoms of men's violence against women. Treat the damn cause, men's violence. This is a man problem that women pay the price for." Actress Tracy Ann Oberman posted, "Let's never forget Sabina Nessa. News channels, keep the pressure on and the story up so close after Sarah Everard. We need to reclaim the streets. Women have to be safe and feel safe. Tragic and sickening. Thoughts with her family." Emma Barnett added, "Sabina Nessa, the 28-year-old school teacher killed in a park. A vigil will be held tomorrow, 6 months on from the murder of Sarah Everard. What has to change?" That vigil was held on Friday, September 24th at 7 p.m., right in Pegler Square, where that CCTV footage captured both a car and that suspicious man. It's also the location where Sabina had been planning to meet her date. Over 500 people showed up to honor Sabina and support her family. Sabina's sister Jabina spoke, breaking down in tears as she addressed the crowd. She said, "I just want to say thank you to everyone who came today to show support for my sister. We have lost an amazing, caring, beautiful sister who left this world far too early." Her husband took her side as she began to cry. She continued, "I just want to say thank you for everyone who came here to show support and respect to my sister, who we have lost. An amazing, very beautiful sister who left this world far too early. She did reach 2 next month to love her family. We had lost our sister, my parents have lost their daughter, and my girls have lost such a brilliant love and care and auntie who dearly loved her. Words cannot describe how we are feeling. This feels like we are stuck in a bad dream and can't get out of it. Remember, while all of this is going on, the killer is still out there. By now, the autopsy results had come in. Sabina's wounds were horrific. As I already told you, she was hit 34 times in the head with a blunt object. Her skull was fractured, she had several broken ribs, and her liver had sustained damage. She had also been strangled, and she was in such bad condition that it was not clear how she died. It could have been the trauma to her head or asphyxiation. So her cause of death was labeled as undetermined, but the manner of death was, of course, homicide. There were also defensive wounds to her right hand, and although there were no injuries to Sabina's private areas and no evidence of the presence of anyone else's bodily fluids, the removal of her tights and underwear, the way in which her outer clothing was moved, and how she was positioned all pointed to her being violated. The pressure was on to find her killer. Investigators decided to gather all ANPR records for Nissan Micras that passed within a 2-meter radius of the crime scene on the night of Sabina's murder, and between the time the killer left the park and about 2 hours before. There were hundreds of owners that needed to be looked into. After about 60 had been ruled out, one particular vehicle stood out, not just because it was a newer silver Nissan Micra, but because it wasn't usually in this area ever. The ANPR records show how many times a license plate has ever been recorded traveling into a specific area, and this Nissan Micra had been purchased and registered in the last year or so in a town called Eastbourne, which is about an hour and a half away from Kidbrooke. It's a seaside town in East Sussex, England, and the only time this vehicle had ever traveled to London was on the day of Sabina's murder. I mean, that would definitely stand out. It's like they came there just to kill her. So, who was this person, and why would they target her? Investigators didn't know the why, but now they knew the who. The owner of that car was a 36-year-old man named Koci Selamaj. They ran a simple background check on him, and they learned he had no prior convictions. So naturally they were perplexed. They wondered if this guy had anything to do with this crime, or if it was just his car that was used to commit it. It seems unusual that a person with no criminal record would commit such a heinous murder. But remember, just because there's no record doesn't mean they haven't committed a crime. Maybe they just haven't gotten caught yet. And now, once again, they needed to backtrack to find out what Koci was doing in the days leading up to Sabina's murder and who he was. So they did a little more digging. Koci was born in Elbasan, Albania, to his father Bashkim and his mother Tefta, and he spent his childhood in one of the poorest parts of Elbasan. The apartment they lived in was small, and it was located at the top of a crumbling set of stairs in an old 5-story building. Koci's neighbors remember him as a nice boy that used to play with other children when he was growing up. There really are no jobs available in this area, so the unemployment rate is very high and many residents are impoverished. To make ends meet, they usually resort to selling homegrown vegetables, secondhand clothing, or other odds and ends as street vendors. But since many people in this community can't afford food and clothing, it's not a booming business. It's a very sad situation. Koci's father was lucky enough to be able to work as a builder and brought in some extra money, while Koci's mother stayed home to raise him, his older brother, and 2 sisters. Her family were cattle farmers, and they lived in the countryside in a very remote part of Albania. The Selamaj family was known to their community, and Koci's parents were considered to be good, respectable people. Koci's father knew they were very poor and that there were no opportunities for young men where they lived, so he had high hopes that his sons would find opportunities elsewhere. So, 20 years earlier, in 2001, Koci, who had dropped out of high school, was 16 years old, and he left Albania with his older brother. By 2015, 30-year-old Koci had other plans, and that is when he immigrated to England. However, his move to the UK wasn't for the same noble reasons as Sabina's parents. He came there illegally. Koci paid someone to transport him to England, hidden in the back of a truck. He arrived in the seaside city of Eastbourne and began establishing himself by starting to work odd jobs here and there. Ultimately, he found a job at ES Car Wash during the day and delivered pizzas for Domino's at night so he could get ahead. His co-workers said that he was very ambitious. He wanted to do better in life, especially because he had met a Romanian woman in 2007 who was 9 years older than him, and he wanted to settle down. Her name is Ionela, and she's a European national. The two began dating, even though it seemed like they were a bit mismatched, not just because of the age gap, but neither one of them practiced the same religion or spoke each other's languages. Koci was Muslim and Ionela was Christian. He wasn't religious, but she was. However, both of them knew enough Italian to be able to communicate with one another, and those who knew them said they were truly in love. There were pictures on Ionela's Facebook page that included a photo of them smiling together with the caption saying, "London with my lover, forever together." Another picture shows them in Brighton. Koci is dressed nicely in a dark suit and tie, and Ionela is wearing a strapless turquoise dress. They look very happy together, just an ordinary couple. It wasn't just a relationship of convenience and let's say Koci to stay in the UK because she was a citizen of the European Union. She was allowed to live in the country legally while Koci was still in the country illegally. But as luck would have it, just before Brexit was signed into law, the government announced that spouses of EU citizens would be allowed to stay in the country legally and permanently. So, it does make you wonder, did Koci want to marry her to stay? But instead, it seemed like they were genuinely in love. Friends said they were very affectionate with one another, and by November 5th of 2018, on Bonfire Night, they were married at City Hall among a group of their friends. Bonfire Night is celebrated across the UK. There are fireworks, bonfires, sparklers, and toffee apples. The reason they do this is because it's the anniversary of a failed attempt to blow up the Houses of Parliament. So, after getting married, the couple moved into an apartment above the shops on the High Street in Eastbourne. Ionela ended up getting a job as a part-time belly dancer and as a maid in a nearby hotel, while Koci switched to working as a gas station attendant so that he could save more money for a better apartment. He told his friends that marrying Ionela was the best thing that ever happened to him. Koci still went back to Albania to see his family every now and then. His last trip home was in September of 2020. With everything, investigators pulled up on Koci from the background check, interviewing co-workers, friends, and even people from his old town. They wondered, was this really the guy they were looking for? What reason would he have to murder Sabina? It really wasn't making sense. There were no known connections between them at all. However, Koci did look like the man that they saw on the footage holding up that red item in his hand in Pegler Square on the night of the murder. And he drove the exact same car that was spotted there. I mean, he is either the most unlucky man alive at this very moment, or he was involved. Remember that they're still backtracking his steps, and as they gather more APR data from tracking the Nissan, they see that he had been at the Grand Hotel in Eastbourne on the same day of Sabina's murder, Friday, September 17th. This hotel is only a 5-minute drive from Koci's home, so they wonder what business he would have over there, since they didn't think he would need or even be able to stay in a place like that. If you're not familiar, this is a very luxurious oceanside hotel. The name says it all. It's grand, it's extravagant, it's an ivory tower after tower of rooms, and inside it's just gorgeous. It looks like royalty would live there. It's around £325 a night, which is roughly $420. So this is a really nice hotel, one that you would stay at for a special occasion unless you're very wealthy. So, what was the occasion? Well, here's where things get interesting. Police contacted the hotel to inquire about whether they had a record of Koci being there as a guest, and they said yes. The staff explained that Koci had come into the hotel on Tuesday, September 14th, and asked to pre-book a room for Friday, the 17th. Well, since it was so last minute, they only had one room still available, and it was even more costly than usual. But he said he didn't care. He was very determined to get this room. He worked at a gas station for minimum wage, so this was well outside his standard of living. Investigators wondered what this hotel would have to do with the murder, since it's over an hour and a half away from Kidbrooke. Well, that's when the staff explained they had an issue with Koci. When he came in to check in on Friday, they ended up calling Sussex Police's non-emergency line to report an incident. At around 1:15 p.m. on Friday afternoon, Koci arrived in the lobby to check into his room. This was captured on video. You can see him in the bottom left of the screen. He comes through the door carrying a duffel bag and makes his way to the front desk. During check-in, he becomes irate. He's yelling at the staff when they ask him for his credit card to prepay for the room. He said, "You already have my banking details. Why do I need to pay before I've even stayed?" He was causing a scene and making the staff uneasy, but it wasn't just because he was being difficult. It was because some of them knew who he was. Yeah, his estranged wife worked at this hotel as a housekeeper. Estranged wife? Koci and Ionella had split up a month before this, in August. Ionella decided to move out due to things not working out between them anymore. The staff was well aware that they were not on the best of terms, so it struck them as very odd that he was trying to check into a room at the hotel where she worked. It was a red flag. They knew he lived close by and that he didn't need a place to stay, so they weren't quite sure what he would be doing there. Something just didn't feel right about the situation. They figured that he most likely wanted to impress her, a last-ditch effort to try to get her to take him back, to show her that he could afford to give her the nicer things in life. Instead of being an employee, she would be an honored guest that night. But it didn't work out. About an hour after he settled in, he messaged Ionella on WhatsApp from his room on the 3rd floor while she was working on the floor below him. She had no idea at this time that he was staying at the hotel because she was busy working and was not notified about it yet. He asked her to meet him in the parking lot just to have a chat, without mentioning that he had just checked in at the same hotel she was working at. She thought that he had just driven over to her work to talk about their relationship, and at this point, they had been broken up for about 6 weeks. He had made a number of attempts to try to get her back at this point. He appeared desperate, and it did seem like it had something to do with his citizenship and also his pride. The truth was, Ionella wasn't interested in getting back together, but she hoped if they talked one final time, he would get the closure he needed and get the message that she was done. Then maybe he would finally leave her alone. Many people in similar situations as Ionella feel the exact same way. They hope that they'll be able to get through to this person that they once loved if they just try hard enough. But people like Koci cannot be convinced, and no amount of persuasion is going to change their mind. They feel entitled to control and dominate their partners. They liken them to possessions, and they believe they have ownership over them. This sense of entitlement is often reinforced by their inability to empathize with others, all of which makes it nearly impossible for them to recognize or accept that their actions are unwanted and invasive. If they can't accept that what they're doing is wrong, then they definitely won't be able to accept that someone wouldn't want them to do it to them anymore. But in this case, Ionela decided to acquiesce. She met him outside the hotel in the parking lot. He wanted to talk inside his car, which was parked outside, and he got in the driver's seat while she got in the passenger side, and they began their chat. But midway through the conversation, Koci was convinced that in order to make everything right between them, all they had to do was just have sex, because maybe being intimate would remind Ionela of what they had, their bond. So he suggested that they get into his back seat, and he climbed back there and tried to convince her to join him. But Ionela felt tricked. It made her feel disgusted that it seemed like all he wanted to do was sleep with her. The thought of having sex with him was appalling. At this point, she realized that this whole conversation was pointless, and she knew in that moment he was never going to change. She did not want to take him back, so she left without speaking another word to him. When she got back into the hotel, that is when her boss informed her about the altercation in the lobby earlier that day, and that Koci was actually booked into a room there. This made her very uneasy. She explained that he appeared very agitated when they met in the parking lot. She wasn't sure what was bothering him, but he was acting strange from the moment they met up. This is when Sussex police were contacted. It was around 4:40 p.m. A hotel staff member said they wanted to report an unruly guest and explained that there had been a disagreement between Koci Selamaj and the reception desk at the hotel, and that initially it was in regard to him not wanting to pay for his room. In addition, Ionela explained everything that I just told you, that her estranged husband was staying at the hotel, and it made her feel uncomfortable. It was clear Koci wasn't there for a luxurious getaway. He was there for her. He knew the only place that he could access Ionela without her being able to escape or get away from him in any way was at work, because she wasn't going to risk her job. The staff went on to explain to police that he had been hanging around the lobby pretending to read a newspaper or look at tourist pamphlets. However, he was actually watching and waiting for Ionela. It wasn't just Ionela who felt uneasy. Koci would leer at other women who walked through the lobby, staring them up and down without trying to hide it. His behavior made both the staff and guests at the hotel very uncomfortable. But no matter how many times they told him to please stop, he would come back and do it again. Now things are starting to come together, sort of. At least they now know that things were not good in the marriage between Ionela and Koci. Even though Koci was creating a sense of unease at the hotel, he wasn't technically doing anything illegal. As a result, the police considered the altercation resolved and did not send an officer to the hotel. Things seemed to be okay after this, because Ionela saw Koci drive off in his Nissan away from the premises and figured that maybe he would just go home and not come back. However, when the police traced where his vehicle went next, through cell phone data and ANPR records, they found that around 5 p.m. he drove to Brighton. Now, recall the picture and caption on Ionela's Facebook profile mentioning a date in Brighton. Perhaps this was his way of reminiscing about the good times, or maybe it was something much more sinister. Brighton is 30 miles away, and he was just driving up and down the streets aimlessly, back and forth, as if he were stalking someone, waiting for someone, or targeting them. But who? Presumably a victim. To investigators, it seemed like Koci had decided he needed to satisfy his craving for sex. Ionela had rejected his advances, so he was determined to find someone who couldn't say no. Was he looking for someone specific, or was he just randomly scouting for a potential victim? A woman alone, unsuspecting, whom he could take advantage of. Notably, this area was mostly residential, but there were also some parks and green spaces where someone could hide, as well as the University of Brighton nearby. Perhaps he was prowling for a university student, which is terrifying. The dormitory buildings are easily accessible, located right off the main road, with dense woods behind them. But maybe it was too bright outside at the time, with too many people around, for him to carry out an attack. Instead, it seems like he decided to increase his odds, so he headed to London, a city with a population of 10 million. London was another place where he and Ionella had posed for a picture, which she had posted on Facebook during happier times. Was this a coincidence? Who knows? Maybe these were the only places he had ever been. We don't know. But for whatever reason, he targeted the South London area of Kidbrooke, an hour and a half away. He arrived in the area around 7:41 p.m., with his car captured on traffic cameras entering town. Minutes later, his car pulled into Pegler Square, where it was first spotted during the investigation. Next, the investigators located CCTV footage from nearby businesses that were open at the time. They caught a glimpse of him entering the Sainsbury's supermarket at 7:46 p.m., just 200 feet away from where he parked. At this point, innocent Sabina was getting ready at her apartment, just streets away from where this man was planning his attack. How do we know that's what he was doing? I think it's obvious, just by his prowling behavior. But it gets even more morbid. The interior CCTV caught Koci in the kitchenware aisle, clearly on a mission to pick out a weapon to aid him in this quest to render an unsuspecting woman unconscious so he could have his way with her. He looked at all the options, literally scratching his head, wondering what he should choose. Finally, he grabbed a rolling pin, something you'd usually use to roll dough, and slapped it in his hand, testing its force. But then he put it back and continued down the aisle, still looking. Moments later, he came back, retrieved the rolling pin again, feeling it to see if it would do. He took a few last looks around before grabbing an energy drink and chili powder, then checked out with these 3 items and a bag. The evidence even showed that he used his bank card at the store. He didn't even bother to use cash. Investigators believe these were pretty odd items to buy together, but maybe he was going to throw the pepper in someone's face. The energy drink? Well, he's about to attack someone, so I guess that made sense. He needs a little extra energy. We're watching someone plan a murder. Just remember that as he's walking down these aisles, he knew exactly what he was going to do. And it actually makes me sick thinking about how calm and collected he is. Like this was just an ordinary shopping trip. He goes back to his car, opens the trunk to retrieve his hoodie, and that's when he sees something better inside. He leaves the rolling pin in the trunk and pulls out a traffic triangle from the bottom of that trunk area. It's one of those emergency reflective traffic triangles used to alert other drivers that they're approaching an unexpected stationary vehicle. A common piece of road safety equipment found in most vehicles in the UK. Now you might be a little confused because wouldn't it be obvious? Well, when these are unfolded and set up, they form a 3D triangle, and they're pretty sizable. The base is typically weighted or stabilized to ensure it remains upright, but they come packaged in a flat, compact shape. If you're watching, they're folded down into a straight line about 2 feet in length, and they have a bit of weight to them, 4 pounds to be exact. Definitely heavier than that rolling pin, and they're made of metal. He kept it folded, that's what was in his hand, causing the glimmer in the park at night, and that was what was captured on CCTV in Pegler Square when he returned with it in his hands. It's red. Now, his choice to grab the triangle instead of going with a rolling pin ultimately gave him away. At 8:08 p.m., he enters the park, a whole 22 minutes before the attack. He's seen on camera just walking around, looking for a victim. He's a predator looking for prey. He's got his hood up over his head, and he's hiding and waiting for a woman walking alone. That's when he sees Sabina, and you know the rest. He hit her 34 times with this hard, rigid metal traffic triangle with such force that it began to unfold. He continued hitting her with it until part of it broke. Then he left the park just before 9 p.m., walked back to his car, put the triangle in his trunk, and then drove away to Eastbourne, back to the Grand Hotel, like nothing happened. He's seen on lobby footage 4 minutes after midnight, returning with his duffel bag and heading to his room. They got him. He had the same sweatshirt and black shoes with the white SES on them during check-in at the lobby, at the supermarket, and in the footage in Pegler Square. It's him, it's obvious it's him. But now they have to prove it with enough evidence. He killed an innocent woman because he was rejected by his estranged wife and wanted to pleasure himself and take his anger out. Koci checked out of his hotel the next day. He went to work like nothing happened, and for 9 days he acted normal. He thought he got away with it. He thought he planned well, a faraway place, an alibi at the hotel, even his wife saw him. He took Sabina's clothing, wiped down the bench. But sir, you forgot you had a digital footprint. Police showed up at Koci's apartment in the early morning hours of September 26th with an arrest warrant, and they took him into custody. Once in custody, suspects are allowed to be held for 24 hours until police have enough evidence to keep them longer. Then it can be extended to 36, 48, and then 96 hours if police have the authority. There was a lot of pressure for them to find the murder weapon, the clothing he was wearing, and most of all, Sabina's DNA. But with all the time that had passed, they didn't expect to find any of that. When they searched his apartment, they located the exact black Skechers sneakers with a thick white sole and the sweatsuit he wore on the night of the murder. It was actually in the dryer. It had already gone through a wash cycle, but at least they had it to compare to the footage. But they had something better. Sabina's blood was found on the sneakers, a very tiny droplet on the sole that Koci probably didn't think was still there. They also located the rolling pin in his trunk, but they still couldn't locate the weapon or Sabina's missing clothing. Detectives got in touch with Ionella, and she was interviewed. She explained that she had no idea that Koci was being tracked by police. She said she came by the apartment the night before to retrieve some things and possibly talk to him about their breakup, but she told police that when she saw him, his face was different. He hardly wanted to talk to her, wouldn't let her inside, and she noticed he was wearing new shoes. Now, he didn't have a lot of money to spend on things like that. That was a luxury for him, so it was definitely something noticeable that he had a brand new pair of shoes. You would think he would throw the other pair away. Maybe he just hadn't gotten to it yet. But now, it was her turn to speak to detectives about what she knew. Ionella told them that after they were married, things changed, and she experienced his increasingly erratic behavior firsthand. Things had gotten even worse in the last year when Koci began pressuring her to move to London. But at the time, he was delivering pizzas, and she didn't think they could afford to move, so she refused. That's when he changed. He became cold, aggressive, and then violent. Neighbors even recalled hearing loud arguments when they first moved in, but over the next few months it got worse. He had strangled her on 3 separate occasions. The first time was when Ionella didn't answer one of his calls. He just began yelling at her, saying, "Why didn't you answer your phone?" She said she was just in bed and was shocked when he came at her. But then he snapped out of it and let her go, though he never apologized. And the next time was when he found out that she had spoken to an ex of hers. The final time he tried to hurt her was when she came home from work and brought him home some food that she knew he liked. Instead of being thankful, he was dismissive and aggressive, and she didn't know why. She didn't know why he was treating her so badly. She felt like he hated her. They weren't sleeping in the same bed anymore. They weren't eating together in the house. And later, when he returned from his late shift at work, he didn't say a word. He just ran at her, put his hands around her neck, and started to choke her. She thought she was going to die. He throttled her to the point where she would almost pass out, or actually pass out, and then he would let her come to. For some reason, he stopped before ever killing her. The last time he did this was in August, when she finally decided she wanted to leave him for good. She was so scared she stayed with him out of fear, and she said she didn't go to the police because she didn't think they would believe her, as she had no visible marks, no bruises, no witnesses. Now, she feels lucky to be alive, but is struggling to come to terms with feelings of guilt for not having done something to stop him so he wouldn't hurt someone else. She didn't understand why he would choose an innocent girl. She never thought he would reach the point where he would be capable of murder. Physical violence, yes, but killing someone, no. She said that she had little to no contact with him for the past 6 weeks until he asked her to meet him on September 17th. When she met with him, she said he was very anxious and impatient. She had never seen him like that before. She also noticed a bottle of alcohol in his car and could smell it on his breath. He wasn't drunk at the time, but he was acting very strangely. It's all beginning to make a lot more sense now. As investigators were finalizing their evidence to present to the prosecution, they realized something. While examining the route he took back home from Kidbrook after the murder, they discovered 8 unaccounted minutes and realized that he had gone off course. He took a detour on a country road in Tonbridge Wells, close to the River Tees. When he passed a farmhouse in that area, his car was actually caught on camera. Investigators realized he most likely stopped here to throw evidence into the river. So, they got divers out there, along with the Kent Fire and Rescue Service, to help them search around Dundale Road. They wanted to find anything within throwing distance in the water. Using magnets to search the riverbed, they eventually got a hit. They found the traffic triangle. This is excellent detective work. They already had him, but this added more evidence to solidify the conviction. Upon his arrest, he was provided with a translator because he didn't speak English very well. Investigators pressed him to tell them why he did this, but he wouldn't say a word. He was calm, collected, and unwilling to talk. And while I don't know the laws there, here it's your right to remain silent. Nevertheless, he denied any involvement in Sabina's death and refused to answer their questions. At that time, he wasn't officially charged yet, so they couldn't leverage anything to get a confession. But once he was in his cell, they saw him with his head in his hands, pacing up and down. They believed at that point what he had done was finally beginning to sink in. On September 27th, the Crown prosecution presented all their evidence, and he was charged with murder. He put his head in his hands, and it seemed like he wanted to make a deal. Through his interpreter, he asked, "What will happen to me if I open up now and say everything?" But he was cautioned not to speak. His defense attorney informed the court that his client planned to plead not guilty at the preliminary hearing on September 30th, which he did. There's much more to tell about what he did, what he said, what he admitted, and what he didn't. But before I continue, I really want to touch on the second vigil. They put on a second candlelight vigil for Sabina on October 5th, following Koci's arrest. This time, to make a bold statement, hundreds of people gathered in Eastbourne, where the killer resided. In attendance was his estranged wife, Ionella. She was seen bawling in the middle of the crowd, muttering under her breath through tears that it should have been her. It should have been her that was dead, not Sabina. Kind people around her comforted her, and when they realized who it was, one woman allowed her to sob on her shoulder and kept hugging her. Ionella just kept saying she doesn't understand what Koci had against Sabina, and that it would have made much more sense if he had killed her, not Sabina. She held a lot of guilt for not doing more when she had the chance, and she was so ashamed to be the wife of a killer that she could barely make it out her front door. Eventually, she moved back to Romania. Then, on October 23rd, which would have been Sabina's 29th birthday, her family got together and released balloons to celebrate her life. Everyone in attendance was given packets of sunflower seeds to plant because that was Sabina's favorite flower. Her sister Jabina said they're bright and they stand up tall, just like Sabina. She also said that since what happened, she now has to think twice about going out, and it's changed her perspective on everything, mentioning that she finds the pain of Sabina's death unbearable. She said, "People say I'm so sorry for your loss and that time is a healer, but it's not. It's a load of rubbish. It gets no easier. I want her to walk in the door, but it's never going to happen again." To honor Sabina, plans were made to design a garden in her name, where the children from her school can remember her. They also wanted to create a positive association with green spaces like parks and gardens, so that these children won't associate them with their teacher's death and be fearful of such spaces. Lisa Williams, the head teacher, said, "I know very much she would have wanted her children not to be tainted by this. She was young, She was beautiful and she was an optimist. She would have wanted her children to be full of life and ambition and to support them to get through it. However, she also pointed out that they would need to talk to the children about safety and how to spot danger and all the other important things that will hopefully protect them from harm. That's not going to be easy. They're so young, and they should be able to be free to play outdoors with their friends and not think about danger. But that, unfortunately, is the world that we live in. It's not always safe, which is truly sad. Now, let me tell you what transpired at the next hearing on December 16th. At this point, Koci admitted to rendering Sabina unconscious, but said that he did not kill her. It appeared that he was planning to use a mental health defense, but the prosecution was one step ahead of him. They were like, nope, that's not gonna fly, not with all the planning that went into this crime. By January 27th, Koci's attorney said that he does not dispute that he is responsible for killing Sabina. He doesn't dispute the facts of the case presented by the prosecution, except that it was sexually motivated. Yeah, he was having a really hard time admitting that part. I wonder why he admitted that he was the attacker, but he made it clear that he did not accept that they were saying he removed some of her clothing, that he raised her skirt up, or that she was exposed. Okay, so how did those things happen if it wasn't him? Was it some kind of second perpetrator just walking by the scene and coming upon her in the bushes? He never elaborated on why he would have even attacked Sabina to begin with. The trial was then set for June of 2022, but on February 14th, the defense indicated that Koci would finally be pleading guilty to murder at the hearing on the 25th of February, and that is what he did. His sentencing was scheduled for April 8th, and guess what? He decided he didn't want to show his face. He decided he didn't want to show his face. He didn't want to show up for Sabina's family and all the other people that he knew would be staring him down, so he remained in his jail cell like the coward that he is. Sabina's family members gave very moving victim impact statements, with Sabina saying that Koci is an awful human being and doesn't deserve his name to be said, that he's a disgusting animal. Her family added that Sabina had every right to be walking through the park, all glammed up and going to enjoy herself after a long week at work. Her parents said that he had no right to take her away from them in such a cruel way, and that Koci robbed her and them of her life. They wanted it to be known that she was an amazing role model who defied all norms. She strove to be independent and was powerful, fearless, bright, and an amazing soul. She died in a way that no one should, and that will torment them all and Sabina's friends for the rest of their lives. Now it was time for both sides, the prosecution and defense, to argue what the sentence should be, with the defense bringing in any mitigating factors. There were some legal mitigating factors. Maybe we wouldn't agree that they should be mitigating, but the fact that he had no criminal record, for example, is a real legal way to mitigate. This was his first offense, per se, that they know about at least, and of course his upbringing and things like that. But when they were finished, the judge stated that in the absence of any explanation from Mr. Koci about why he attacked Sabina, he was going to defer to the prosecution's argument that it was sexually motivated, especially with all of the evidence. At which point the defense attorney said that their client offered no challenge to the prosecution's case. So essentially, he accepts it. He accepts that he attacked her, he killed her, and it was sexually motivated, but he still would not provide any details or explanation for his actions. His defense ended with the statement that their client simply accepted that he had done it and noted that Koci had given him no instructions to express any remorse on his behalf, which goes to show you how heartless he really is. And of course, as can be expected, the sentencing did not bring Sabina's family any closure, other than knowing that Koci would be behind bars. The judge ultimately sentenced him to a minimum of 36 years in prison, but I gotta say that's all. Because even though he's been deemed dangerous and did this heinous attack on someone, he still has a chance at parole in his 70s. But I gotta tell you, he's probably never going to get out because within a year, he attacked 2 prison guards. They came to investigate some commotion in his cell, and he brutally attacked one of them with a piece of porcelain that broke off the toilet. He actually managed to stab that officer in the right thigh and in the arm before more staff members came to subdue him. Then that's when he punched another officer in the face, adding more time to his sentence and, of course, again showing how dangerous this man really is. While in prison, Koci's 73-year-old dad Bashkim and his sister Galanda tried to visit him multiple times. His dad even begged him to tell him why he killed Sabina, but Koci refused to leave his cell and meet with them. His father spoke to the media and said, "Koci has a strong character, but now he's realizing what he has done, and it's shameful. That shame stops him from meeting with his family." He actually cut his family off completely, but his dad still tried to make contact with him, saying that he'd like to know from Koci himself why he did it, adding that the murder of Sabina caused a huge tragedy to her family, and that he still cannot believe that his son was involved. And that it also caused a tragedy for their family as well. He explained that he's an older man, suffering from several illnesses after a head operation several years ago. Though he knows his son is a killer, he'd at least like to see him before he dies. The same goes for his mom, who's 70. He said he feels pain for Sabina losing her life, but he also has lost his son. He tried visiting, writing letters, and still received no response. He doesn't wish this on anyone. He wanted to make that clear. He never had any problems with Koci as a child and doesn't understand how he could do this to someone he didn't even know. Hit them in the head 34 times. He let the public know that they were so sad for Sabina, that she was a human being who did not deserve to die that way. He also wanted to apologize to Sina's family, but unfortunately he could not get the courage to face them. He told the Sunday Mirror that he and his daughter really wanted to apologize to Sabina's family for what Koci did, but he just didn't have the courage to come face to face with them. He has 2 daughters himself, and he understands what it would be like to lose one. To be fair, his son left home when he was only 16, so maybe he hadn't turned into the monster that he would later become. But I do feel bad for both of these families. I, of course, have to feel more pain for Sabina's family because Koci had a choice. Sabina didn't. She didn't choose to be murdered. She wanted to make a difference. And even though it's in such a tragic way, she is because her story highlights this epidemic of violence towards women and girls. She lives on in all of us, and every single time we tell her story, in every single person who gets to know her by watching videos like this. I want to end with words from Sabina. She says she hopes for a cultural shift that challenges the conditions in which boys and men are taught that girls and women are inferior and undeserving of respect and protection. She said, "If I can do something from what we've experienced as a family to bring some sort of change, then I will. It will be Sabina's legacy. I want women to be able to walk the streets alone any time of the day,